Man, there's so much I want to say, just in terms of thanks and for having us, and how happy we are to be here, and the camaraderie I feel like we have as a fellow Reformed Baptist church up in around Birmingham area. But everything that I say right now is just going to cut into how much time I have to get through as much as I want to get through, because we're trying to cover a big subject in a short amount of time. So I'll try and save most of that for tomorrow. But thank you so much for having us. We have felt so welcome. We pray for you guys regularly, and I know you pray for us, which is really neat to meet a church that you regularly pray for and finally get to meet. But you guys come up on my phone, and we pray for you guys, and really appreciate Shane a lot, and happy that we've gotten to. All right, I just need to cut myself off, all right, and get into this. So I have way too much material to get into. If you knew how much I was attempting to cover, you probably wouldn't let me start. So very honored to be here, and. The title that I have for these, which you've probably seen, is the Anabaptist, the junk drawer of the Reformation. And I know that sounds pejorative when you hear it. You hear junk and you're like, oh, he's saying they're all junk. And it's not meant to be derogatory. So I'll explain what that means. We're going to do a general overview of the Anabaptists. We're not going to have time to get into each individual dance or group. We're going to sort of dance between going over what they were in the 16th and 17th century as they arose, and what they have become now, because it's not exactly the same thing. It was pretty broad, that category was pretty broad, and it has now narrowed quite a bit to a more definable tradition, I think you could say. So my argument that I would make is that then they were the junk drawer of the Reformation. That's what they were, and they have since become a group of pietistic monks, modern-day pietistic monks, a holiness-type movement, which is part of what they were, but it has narrowed to be that almost exclusively. So there's a broadness of who was considered Anabaptist in the 16th century, but it has since developed into this identifiable, more narrow tradition. And we're condensing this into 2.5, 3 lectures, but this legitimately, it could be an entire semester covering, honestly, even one group of them. Let alone the whole group. But the history is super, super interesting. First time I gave these lectures, I got some criticism from a Mennonite guy, or at least he was raised Mennonite. I don't know if he was still Mennonite, but he was associated with Mennonite somehow. And he was like, well, you didn't give enough detail about each specific group. Or, I was like, that's just impossible. That's the task at hand is not to tell you the idiosyncrasies of each little group. That's impossible, because they're endless and always interesting, but you can spend so much time on it that you could never get through them all. And you couldn't keep track of it all anyway, because it all starts to blend together. So we just don't have that kind of time. We're going to have to do a high-level overview with some of the interesting details sprinkled in that give you an idea of the character of what the Anabaptists are like or were like. So my task tonight is going to be to cover the Anabaptist, but not go into that sort of detail. And it is something I have a vested interest in. It's something that I continually study and put into, because I got into this subject more because I was born into it. I was born into an Anabaptist group. I was raised in it. I was a voluntary member of it, of an Anabaptist church until I was about 28 years old or so, right after my first daughter was born. And it was like, all right, we can't raise our kids on this. So like any other particular or peculiar religious group, there's really no better education about them than having lived among them, being a part of them by conviction. A guy that comes out of the Mormon church has a better feel for what they're like. We can study them on paper, but they know what it's like to be Mormon. And so they can kind of convey that sort of thing to people that only study them on paper. So that's sort of what I'm hoping I can do for the Anabaptist, or about the Anabaptists. Now, the best known groups, in terms of the Anabaptist groups that you've probably heard of, would be the Mennonites, the Amish, and the Hutterites are probably the big three. In terms of, you've heard the names, most likely. I wasn't a part of any of those. I was part of one of the branches called the Apostolic Christian Church. And there are 7 primary groupings for the Anabaptists now, the tradition. Some of these are sort of like the OG guys. There's the Swiss Brethren, or the Mennonites. We'll talk about them. They're some of the original groups. They're also now the broadest group, so you can have some very liberal Mennonites that are almost like hippie types, peaceniks, and they like the pacifism of it, but they're also very liberal, it's strange. And then you can have some that are all the way on the other spectrum where they're old order Mennonite. And they're very similar to the Amish that way. And you'll find most of these in the Midwest and Pennsylvania. You'll see a lot of them in the Midwest, all of them, because they're all German. It's all Swiss-German background. And that's where they settled in the U.S. So there's a lot of them in Pennsylvania and throughout the Midwest. And then the Hutterites, they're another group. They are more influenced by the Moravian world, the pietistic world, the radical pietism that arose. They prefer to be in sparsely populated countryside. They're very rural, and you'll see that amongst all of them. They're very rural, but they like to be in the sparsely populated areas. Presently, they're mostly located in northern places like the Dakotas, a little bit in Wisconsin, Montana, and then north of that into Canada. And like any good red-blooded American, I have no idea about Canadian geography. Like, I can't tell you anything about Canadian geography. So whatever is north of Montana and the Dakotas into Canada, that's where they are. They're sprinkled in there. And then there's the Low Russian or the Russian Low German Mennonites, which is, I mean, they're still the same branch, but they split off and immigrated into Russia at the invitation of Catherine the Great because she wanted German farmers to come in, and they felt comfortable there because they didn't have to serve in the military. And then that changed like 100 years later, and so they shifted. So they're Mennonite, but they're like another branch of the Mennonites. So it's a little bit confusing, but they came from Ukraine, not technically Russia, but Ukraine, which is part of Russia. But they have largely dissipated. They're not a very prominent group. Then there's the Amish. Everybody's heard of the Amish. And the Amish have 6 main branches, actually. And they range in strictness and tradition and how strict they are about use of technology and that sort of thing. And they do not all get along at all. These 6 branches don't. They're also concentrated in the Pennsylvania and in the Midwest. The fifth branch is the Brethren, sometimes called the German Baptists, sometimes called Dunkers, sometimes just referred to as Old Order. These guys developed in Germany. They have some sects amongst them, different groups amongst them that have split up. They don't all get along either. Again, there's a little bit of a range in terms of how traditional they're going to be. And they are also concentrated in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, things like that. And then the 6th branch would be the Apostolic branch, the Apostolic Christian branch. That's the one that we came up in. There's the American branch that is sort of like the original, and then there's what's called the Nazarene branch, and they have more in Canada, and they have a more of the Eastern Europe influence, and there's some reasons to that that's pretty interesting. But when they came to the U.S., they got a bunch of Amish Mennonite converts, and they were even called the New Amish for a while. But it is a distinct tradition. They've had a multiplicity of splits over things. I can tell you a little bit about those at some point, but they're mostly concentrated throughout the Midwest as well. And just think Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Iowa, stuff like that. But all of these have places that they've gotten to randomly, even throughout the world, but in terms of where they're concentrated, it's mostly Midwest. And then the last one is the Bruderhof group. And it's a really small group. They are distinctly Anabaptist. They developed really late, coming out of in the 1920s. They developed, and they had all this association with the Hutterites, but then they had a few differences. But they live very communally. They look like Anabaptists. They talk about Anabaptist. They have a distinct Anabaptist tradition. They're not so closed off to the world. I mean, you can find a YouTube channel and learn all about the Bruderhof, which I'm not very familiar with them in general, but they make their stuff accessible. They have a publishing house, and they are distinctly Anabaptist. So even though they're not super well known, I think they fit in one of the categories, and I think it's fair to put them in there. So there are, amongst these 7 branches, though, there are commonalities and there are distinct differences across all the groups. And the idiosyncrasies between them they're unending, because each one has so many idiosyncrasies that are both silly and interesting. And they're kind of interesting because they are so silly, or they're so arbitrary. They just make things up, and it becomes a thing for them. It is this thing that they hold to tenaciously. There is, even though there's that difference amongst them, though, there is a thematic character across all of them. So I use the analogy of like tie-dye shirts. No two tie-dye shirts are the same. Each one has its own colors, kind of its own patterns. But if you line up a group of tie-dye shirts and you stand back, you're like, oh, I mean, it's a style. It's tie-dye. It has a character, you can pick it out. That's what the Anabaptists are like amongst all their groups. No two are exactly the same, but you see a style, a theme across them. I don't want to spend too much time telling stories of what our life was like, but I do want to give you at least some idea of a few of the things. It gives you a glimpse into this. So all of our pastors, they weren't called pastors, they were called ministers, and they were all laymen. None of them were trained. They didn't receive inside training or outside training. I mean, it was very much discouraged. So they were all laymen. You only have one elder per church, and the rest were ministers. Their ecclesiology is a little bit screwy. When the minister gets up to preach for each service, there'd be a morning service, a lunch, and then after lunch service, the minister would just open the Bible and he'd say, well, my eyes have fallen upon such and such, and he would read that text and preach from it. And so every single sermon was unplanned, and its content was extemporaneously preached, which I don't want to be insulting, but you don't learn anything hardly at all. I mean, you hear a lot of stories, you hear a lot of just random thoughts that this person has, and sometimes they're kind of biblical and sometimes they're not. And it's just very, very, very poor preaching and teaching because of that. The men and women will sit in separate seating, so it's segregated by men and women. There's no jewelry allowed, including wedding rings. Some of those they're pushing the limits. Some of them are starting to wear jewelry outside of church or outside of Sundays. Some will wear wedding rings, every day but Sunday at this point. But the most distinct will not. The men generally would wear dark suits with white shirts. Sometimes if you were outside of church, it'd be khaki pants. Ties, they always wear ties, usually a dark tie, not colorful, not patterns. I used to buy my suits and that sort of thing at Goodwill. I just got thrift store suits and stuff. And I got visited at my home by a brother who, my dress was not conforming enough. So it's the sort of thing that you'll get talked to about, if you're not looking the part. It's not like the rules are laid out either. It's just you learn it. You just live in it and learn it. And I'll talk about that more later. The women would wear their hair up. They would generally keep it in a bun. They would wear head coverings. So there was a little one that kind of looks like a little doily that they would wear most of the time. If you were really holy, you'd wear it around the house. You only take it off to shower. And then they had kind of a longer one that they would put on for church service. Facial hair was banned. It was always banned. Mustaches, everything. Totally banned. Sports were banned. You couldn't play in any organized sports. If you did either one of those, they wouldn't even baptize you. Couldn't be a member. They did just recently start allowing facial hair. At least part of the church did. Started allowing facial hair, so that's changed. Marriage is said to be by faith, so there's no dating at all, and you just put in a marriage proposal, and you submit that to your elder, and that elder calls her elder, and that elder will say, deliver it to her in some form or fashion. Sometimes are you willing to get married? And they'll pray about that, and then, here's the name of the person that's proposing, and then she'll, deliver the message to her elder, who delivers to his elder, who calls him. So I proposed to my wife through my elder, who happened to be her elder, but it was a mess. So that's the way the marriages kind of work. And they're generally really short engagements, maybe 3 months or something. Big weddings, though, everybody comes. It's just part of the church service. So our wedding had 1,500 people at it, I believe. And our reception was 800-something people. And you just stand there and everybody goes through a line and greets you. I mean, some of these things are changing, a little bit here and there, but that's how it was. And the marriage is very, very highly esteemed. That is... if you're 25 and single, then, something went wrong. You're over the hill. It's that kind of attitude about it. Oh, they do greet with a holy kiss still. I think COVID has probably slowed that down a bit, but they've greeted with a holy kiss from the beginning, men with men, women with women. Every time you see somebody at church, every time you go to their house, you greet with a holy kiss. You shake their hand, you say greetings when you leave, you shake their hand, greet him, say farewell. My uncles still do it, all our family stuff. Farewell, brother, greetings, brother, stuff like that. So never quote me on this out of context, but I have literally kissed hundreds of men. So it sounds weird, but it's true. Their church discipline. Yeah. Scratch that. The church discipline is like their grossest abuse. And this is something that has developed as part of the Anabaptist tradition. They will excommunicate if you come in repentance for a sin that they think is serious. You are excommunicated and you rarely get back in. It's hard to get back in after you've been excommunicated. Usually if you're young, you have a better chance. But if you've done something, and even if you're the one bringing it forward saying, I've done this, I'm repentant, I'm sorry, you can get excommunicated for it. Again, something that's changing a little bit, but traditionally that's the way it's been. And it is a horrific abuse of the church. A really, really bad thing. Hard to get membership back. You would automatically lose your membership too if you married outside of the church. If you don't marry a member of the church, you automatically lose your membership. You're just out by default. They do communion once a year. They forbid it at any other church. My dad even still took a long time, I think, to take it. It was so ingrained in him and from his mom, like you don't take it communion anywhere else. I think it was a long time before he felt comfortable taking communion at another church. And you get that feel, it just gets built into you. My wife's church growing up, they didn't take communion for years. No Lord's Supper for years because it was just a tiny little church that met in a hotel room, something like 12 to 15 people. And there was enough dissension in there because one brother didn't like your mom's peacock bangs or the TV in your basement. And that was enough to have no Lord's Supper. So that's the sort of thing that can be a big deal, enough to upset the church. Anabaptists have historically been against new forms of technology. It's a trait that you'll see amongst them. It's at least discouraged, or you're more admired for not having it. Some of them will outright ban it. Some of them are just kind of it's discouraged. You'll never be serving in the church if you have a TV in your house. So a lot of them kind of at least the way we grew up, they found ways to hide their TVs here and there. So it was never banned outright in ours, but it's discouraged. It's preached against, you're looked down upon. I remember hearing a sermon about a minister that bought a new van and had to pay extra money to have the DVD system taken out. And that was so holy. Great. You could just not use it, but I guess pay money to get it out to make a point. A lot of them don't have the internet or TV still. When phones were becoming common, a lot of them were against phones, at least in our church. And I don't mean cell phones, I mean literally telephones. My grandma and grandpa had the kind where you pick it up and you speak into the thing and you hand crank it. They had that on their wall for years. Now they did have an updated rotary phone eventually, but they also left that one up. And for, I guess, young people that don't know what a rotary phone is, it's one of these things. If you ever, I guess it goes this way, but yeah, you can Google it. When cars came out, they were against cars, they were against that. Even in our church in the I think 19th century still, when lightning rods were common on houses, they were against lightning rods because it was you're not showing faith that God won't burn your house down through lightning. So they would I could go on and on and on with these stories. And you could do that in any church. Any of these churches, you could go on and on with these sort of stories amongst them. And my church that I grew up in, I say my church, right? The church we grew up in, much like a lot of the other Anabaptists, they haven't been able to totally avoid the influence of the modern age and modern American evangelicalism and some of the weaknesses with that. They have tried, they do try and shield their people for it. The more Anabaptists they are, the more secluded they'll be, the more they can maintain that distance, but they're not all able to do that. So some of those more ridiculous items have either gone away or it's a thing of the past, or they've begun to fade in some of the local churches, but a lot of it only in recent years. And in a way, I think I can say I'm appreciative of my upbringing. I told Shane this is therapeutic for me in a lot of ways. But I've grown to be more appreciative of that because it has made me more appreciative of biblical doctrine and biblical church polity, seeing why that matters and how it can matter, and especially the gospel, because it's when you're deprived of those things and then you come into them and you see the clarity of it and it changes your life. It just, you care a lot more. So I've kind of likened it to a man that's lost in the desert that comes out and suddenly he has daily access to a water fountain. He doesn't get sick of how wonderful that is. It matters. So if upon hearing that list, though, you're thinking, well, that doesn't really align with the Anabaptist that I've heard of, then don't be surprised by that, because I mean, for us, facial hair was banned, and having stubble even would be viewed as rebellious. But then Amish, on the other hand, like you have to have a beard. Not a mustache, but at least a beard. If you're married, you grow a beard. So it's almost like a requirement. It's part of their tradition. So each one is very different. Each one can have very different things. So I think there's this fascinating intersection of cultures between the Anabaptist and Eastern European immigration in the late 19th and 20th century. The influence their perspective on the acceptability of a mustache, which sounds funny. It's like, what? Who cares? But there was this association with the mustache of the military. So if you're a pacifistic, or once they had become pacifistic, it was like, well, you can't even have the thing that we associate with the military. And the Eastern European immigrants still had them as just part of their culture, and that became a conflicting issue. It led to church splits. I mean, our church split over whether or not you could have a mustache. The one we grew up in, it's crazy. So there's this, we don't have really time to go into that, but it's super interesting. So here's the point I'm really getting at, though. Contrasting my upbringing to something like the Amish with the facial hair thing. Each Anabaptist group tends to have their own set of idiosyncratic traditions. Very, very idiosyncratic traditions. There are similarities amongst the traditions even. Like you see the same ideas sort of behind them. Like, oh, it's because they want to be separate from the world. Or, oh, they don't like technology. But it works its way out in different ways. But there's a unifying characteristic, that you see across these Anabaptist traditions, but none of them are identical. But the thing about them is that the idiosyncratic traditionalism, like that is a hallmark of being Anabaptist. Idiosyncratic traditionalism. And it's the first characteristic of what I would name for the Anabaptists. There are odd practices against or amongst each group without much connection to each other, or like the Catholic is in the historic church. I mean, small c Catholic. And there's no real tie to Scripture itself. It's just a thing that they care about, that they've decided to care about because they've invented these laws. So whatever it is that they develop, wherever their tradition goes, whatever idiosyncratic tradition that they've invented, they will hold to it with a tenacity, an absolute tenacity, to the point where to not do it is considered rebellious and proud, which means you might not be saved at all, and you can't maybe be a part of this group. It's a rebellion against authority. So they're very, very Pharisaical that way, and the idea that they make up traditions and elevate them to the law of God. They treat them the same way as the law of God. And I'll explain a little bit why later. But a lot of Anabaptist churches are drowning their people in Pharisaism. I mean, there's no real better way for it. If you read the Pharisees, you're like, these are proto-Anabaptists in a lot of ways. Make this thing up and care about it to the death, that sort of thing. The traditions they make up get elevated, like I said, to the same law of God. They're enforced by the leaders as if they're equal to God's law, and rebellion against those by not doing them, by not conforming, then you're rebelling against the teaching authority of the church, and that's a big taboo. And it's all really about social taboos. It's all about the social pressure within the group itself, because they can't open a book and say, see, you broke rule number 5B. It's not like that. It's like you just know it. You just do it. You learn it. So doing so is like a sign that you've maybe lost your salvation. And that's another defining characteristic of the Anabaptists, the surety that salvation can be lost. Like they are absolutely sure that you can lose your salvation. I'll talk more about doctrine a little bit later, but they are fiercely Arminian. And they never abandoned the late medieval synergistic semi-Pelagian soteriology of the medieval church. They really haven't. They've essentially tweaked what it looks like, but the idea is exactly the same. It really is. It's faith plus works. And they won't necessarily always say that, but that's what it is. And they will sometimes outright deny it's faith alone. But they definitely wouldn't use the Arminian label for themselves. I mean, Arminians rarely do, but everyone that says, I'm not Arminian or Calvinistic, they're always Arminian. The Anabaptists, though, they would heartily agree with all 5 Arminian points, like even more than the original Arminians. So the point that they would hold to the strongest, though, is that last one about losing your salvation. Like that's a big deal to them. In fact, if you hold to a doctrine If that's the only point of Calvinism that you hold to, like in your minds, their minds, you're a Calvinist. So even like those traditional Southern Baptists that are 4-point Arminians, but they think you can't lose your salvation, to an Anabaptist, they're Calvinistic. So it's just interesting. And they generally see that doctrine as the root of evangelical error. Like evangelicalism, why it's so weak and the churches are so bad, they see that as the root of it. And part of it is the abuse of it, right? They're not completely off on that. They perceive it as an easy believism, carnal Christianity stemming from the fact that everybody thinks they can't lose their salvation. And if it is abused, that is what happens. But the odd thing is their pervasive Arminianism is why you see traditionalist Southern Baptists kind of attempting to find unity with the Anabaptists. They don't like the real history of where Baptists came from, so they try and find unity with the Anabaptists. But the genuine Baptist roots, the genuine article, they came from the Puritans. I'm sure you guys have heard this and studied it. The founders of the SBC even were, blatant Calvinists. So before I get too far into this lecture, I want to sort of describe what I'm trying to convey. I don't want to just give this historical rundown of significant figures and events, though we are going to do a little bit of that. You just have to. And it shapes their history. Their trajectory was kind of set really early on, and it kind of shaped the modern iteration that we find now, although that whole thing was whittled down from what it was. But anybody can read those details, on their own. And I want to do that plus some analysis and diagnosis of it. And I'll tell you now that nearly everything that I say about them, like even the good and the bad things, somebody could fairly respond to that. Well, they'll be like, well, not all Anabaptists. And I'm like, yeah, I know, not all Anabaptists. Yes, you can find a group that's different on this, or they have a slightly different perspective. But this is the general tenor. I'm going to speak of them in the general themes. So I don't want to constantly say like some or many Anabaptists are this way or were this way, but that's going to be the case because there's not absolute unity amongst them. It's general themes. So I'll try to distinguish where I can. And what I hope to leave you with is an understanding of the Anabaptist ethos, like the spirit of the Anabaptist, the character, the thing that like you get a feel for what they're like. I don't know what better really to call it, the Anabaptist ethos. I want you to understand like the feel of the Anabaptists as a movement and as they exist now, because no two groups of them are the same. They're similar teachings and mentalities and characteristics, some of which I've already described, but we're going to do a bit of history with that too. So let's start there with a little bit of history. It goes back to their arrival on the scene during the Reformation, and that's where my title comes from, the junk drawer of the Reformation. And like I said, it sounds pejorative, and I'm not calling them junk, although I wouldn't necessarily hesitate to do that, but that's not what I mean by that title. It's acknowledging a simple historical reality, and that is, like, if you have that drawer in your kitchen or in your pantry somewhere, you have a drawer where there's just a bunch of stuff thrown into it, and it's filled with these odds and ends, and it's usually really messy, and some of the stuff is useful, some of it you probably should have thrown out before, and it's just like the thing that unifies it is that you just have no better place for it. Like, it might as well just be in this drawer where sometimes we open it and find this, a pen or a notepad or stamps or, stuff, paper clips, stapler. How often do you use a stapler? I don't know, once a month. Something like that. There's just stuff in there, and then there's probably old things you threw in there just to get it off the counter. Things like that. There's a hodgepodge of clutter in that junk drawer, and sometimes we just call it a junk drawer, and that's what I mean by it. That's what the Anabaptists were in the 16th century. Back then, that's what they were. They're the junk drawer. There's no good category for these other people. All the people considered Anabaptists, this is like, where else do you put them? Because they're not Protestant, and they're not Catholic, and they're not Lutheran. They're present in the Reformation, but they're not reforming it, or at least their character of their reform is not like the Reformation reform. So here's a big definition. I'll read this twice because it's so long. But they are the category for all of the miscellaneous sects, radicals, revolutionaries, mystics, spiritualists, apocalyptic preachers, and frankly, lunatics, just straight up lunatics that cropped up in Europe during the confusion that naturally emerged from a rigid and stratified religious, socio-economic world that had been turned upside down by the combined forces of the Reformation and the Renaissance. It's a really bad run-on sentence, but I think it captures everything that it was. So I'll read it one more time. The Anabaptists are the category for all the miscellaneous sects, radicals, revolutionaries, mystics, spiritualists, apocalyptic preachers, and, frankly, lunatics that cropped up in Europe during the confusion that naturally emerged from a rigid and stratified religious, socio-economic world that had been turned upside down by the combined forces of the Reformation and the Renaissance. So Europe was turned on its head. The socio-economic world, the religious world, the Renaissance played a role, the Reformation played a role. There's lots of confusion. National borders are kind of in flux here and there. Influence and power is going back and forth, and it just, all these groups sort of emerge. And there had been a tradition of this sort of thing in the area where they came from, coming out of the medieval world, and they just naturally emerged from there. So remember, there was a broadness back then. Like all those groups, the sex radicals, the revolutionaries, the mystics, spiritualists, they're not all unified, really. There's a broadness to what was considered Anabaptist in the 16th century, but it did later develop into a more identifiable tradition. So if we use the term reformer in like the broadest sense possible, in the sense, just the broad sense of saying like they're changing things, they're trying to change things, then I think then you can say that the Anabaptists are the epitome of reformers, but they're reforming with zeal without knowledge. That's kind of what was going on with them. We as Reformed Baptists come from the Reformation, but we do not find our spiritual forefathers amongst the Anabaptists. That is not our roots. So someone will say, well, then why are you guys talking about it? Why are Baptists talking about Anabaptists? Well, I mean, as you know, we didn't come from it. There's no organic origination from them. We came from the particular Baptists in England, amongst the Puritans. They were separatists. The Anglican Church was all too slow to reform. Puritans kind of formed. The Baptists came out of that under Queen Elizabeth and King James, King Charles, and then in the 20s and 30s, we got a particular Baptist identity, and they fully reformed. They were reforming away from the Church of England once they had some space to do it. And that's where you get your particularly distinct Baptist identity. That's where it comes from. We were Puritan. We are Puritan, Reformed, confessional, Calvinistic, covenantal, congregational, Credo Baptist, obviously. That's who we are. That's what they were. That's where we come from. That's our bloodline. The only commonality that we share with the Anabaptists really is the Credo Baptist part. They don't baptize infants either. And there is some similarity with the church and state distinction and separation from church and state where we believe in religious liberty, and that's true, but again, it's different for them. So I say again, the Anabaptists are not our spiritual forefathers at all. Them as a persecuted religious minority, and particular Baptists were the same, we wanted the state to get off our back. We don't want the state dictating how the church should act. We don't want them dictating our beliefs and practices. So we share that commonality, but even there, it wouldn't be accurate to say that the Baptists and the Anabaptists shared the same view of the church and state and the civil realm in general. We don't. I would say that the Reformed and the Reformed Baptists particularly too have respect and understanding for its role, whereas the Anabaptists almost think of it as a necessary evil, and a lot of them withdrew from it, like you shouldn't even participate in it. Some still make that argument. So again, given that they're not our spiritual forefathers, why talk about them? Well, in spite of those historical facts about Baptists, we still get lumped together with the Anabaptists. People assume that the Baptist faith was like the flower that bloomed from the seed of Anabaptism and the Anabaptists. And then the Anabaptists sort of disappeared and developed into the Baptists. And that is not the case. That's not true. The Anabaptists were winnowed. They were diminished into a more identifiable group, but their more radical factions kind of died off. Their theological and philosophical, the civil, political factions that were more radical did disappear, but the Anabaptists themselves never went away. So we talk about them, even though we're Baptists, we talk about them so that we know why they are not us. And their doctrine and practice in history is not our doctrine and practice in history. We understand that we have a distinct identity, partially because we get accused of having that identity. And it's not true. It's just really bad history. So that's really the second reason that we talk about them is it's not our history and people accuse us of that. But some of their characteristics, some of the characteristics of the Anabaptists have become increasingly evident among modern day evangelicals. It's kind of funny how it works, such as the radical independence from even associations that we practice, a radical type of independence, kind of a disdain for the institutional church that has really cropped up in evangelicalism. People have far less problem today throwing out, or at least completely ignoring, centuries of historic creeds and confessions and historical theology and historical orthopraxy, like the things that we do, the practice. They have no problem ignoring them. Every church has its own little statement of faith. So many times when I explain confessionalism, the people are like, look, these things are set. We're just putting ourselves in line with the historic Christian faith. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Evangelicalism, you don't hear about the creeds. You don't hear about confessions. And what the church has done for 2,000 years doesn't make a huge difference to them. Not necessarily that they get everything wrong, but there's a radical independence there that we do not share, that the Anabaptists, you can see that amongst them. So even church polity, the mission of the church membership, worship, all these things, nearly everything, because of the dearth of historical confessionalism and because of the rampant apostasy of the mainline churches, which even we recognize, they're almost wholly apostate. In some legitimate ways, I think it's fair to say that the Anabaptists have promulgated their ethos more pervasively into American Christianity than any other Reformation group. And not that they necessarily tried to do that, but it just kind of happened. They didn't necessarily do that themselves because, they pull back from contact with the evangelical world. But still, evangelicalism has been largely Anabaptized, if we could say it that way. They have some of these trends. And then the last thing that I always say about studying them, one of the last reasons is simply the fact that they are terribly interesting, in my opinion. They really are. And there's no shame in wallowing in just the pure enjoyment of church history and appreciating that sort of thing. I mean, my phone would be nearly empty if we didn't study church history on a regular basis. So let me acknowledge this too. When it comes to studying the Anabaptist, and if you start doing it on your own at all, there is an issue. Many historians, at least the ones that spend significant time on them, they have these rose-colored glasses about who they were and what they are now. And they look at them almost like this friendly little group that just does things a little bit differently. And they have these rose-colored glasses, and they're overly favorable to them. They view them as the underdogs in the Reformation, and the underdog is always like, there's a little bit of pull to kind of like him, root for him a little bit. And they view him that way because of the persecution against him, which, it was legitimately horrible and unjustified. It's terrible what happened to him. But some of these historians then will create an unrealistic picture, and they're overly sympathetic, and they gloss over some of their most significant errors, and they don't give them the critique that they really deserve. And it's it's a little bit like playing with fire. You just don't understand the danger of the thing that you're talking about. And then other historians will simply highlight the craziest ones of the bunch and show how nutty that they could be, and then they would just brush past the rest all too quickly. Which, it's easy to snipe at them. It really is. It's very easy to do. They produced a lot of low-hanging fruit in which we can criticize them. In my opinion, a select few of them, though, are worthy of respect. Most of them which got killed off pretty early, but there's a select few where you can be like, all right, no, we don't totally agree with them, but we can see that these guys were brothers in Christ, really. If you're reading something and the Anabaptists come off looking pretty good, then they're probably, they need harsher judgment. If they come off looking good, the writer is probably not super clear on orthodoxy or their lack of orthodoxy. But if you're reading something and not one of the Anabaptists seems to be a genuine brother in Christ, seeking truth, seeking genuine reform, then in those cases, I think there is a call for some more generous analysis on occasion. So it's hard to find a middle ground between those. That's generally what you're going to find in the sources, the secondary sources. So if you read about it, be aware of it. If you're prompted by any of this to start studying them, I guess pay attention to that sort of thing. I'll try and maintain a proper balance as I deal with them. I do feel this innate tug to defend them because of my upbringing. It's like I want to defend them a little bit. It's like if you're a fat person and you're a little bit offended when fat people get made fun of, but you'll do it yourself. It's just like, not from this source. Like, I'll say what they need to hear, not you. I feel that a little bit, and I know it's a little bit silly, because knowing what I know about their doctrine and their practice, both today and in the past 500 years, I have a near endless list of very harsh criticism and frustrations with them. So I'm tugged both ways, I guess. And I'll be honest, my punitive posture toward them outweighs my defensive posture towards them. I do not have a generally good view of them. And I think that's justified, and I'll try and show you why I think that's justified. Now, with all that being said, let's return to the 16th century. Let's continue getting into the minds of the original Anabaptists. Remember that junk drawer idea, this broad idea. They ranged from these naive biblicists. Again, I don't mean that negatively. I mean, as Reformed happened, as people came out of the Roman Catholic Church, they're not instantly Reformed. They don't instantly know things by leaving the Roman Catholic Church. So there's a lot of naivete that comes from these people that are just getting rid of all that. They're abandoning a tradition, but they don't immediately come into another tradition. So there's some naive biblicists amongst them. And it can range from that to complete kooks, the lunatics, and everything in between. And everything in between that couldn't be fairly called Protestant or Roman Catholic or Lutheran. All those other people, they're kind of grouped together amongst the Anabaptists. And make no mistake, the title Anabaptist was meant as a slander against them. They didn't pick that for themselves. Neither did the Lutherans, neither did the Calvinists. None of those, nobody picks their own label. But it was meant as a slander. It was meant to fearmonger that name Anabaptist. We'll talk about why that became the case in a little bit. It's like today if we called somebody a branch Davidian. I don't know, some of you guys will remember Waco and David Koresh and the branch Davidians. If you call somebody a branch Davidian, that people get what that means. You're calling into account a history of a cult and saying these people are cultish. And or like Jonestownian, saying somebody drank the Kool-Aid. That comes from Jonestown, where they poisoned the Kool-Aid and all committed suicide. That saying, they drank the Kool-Aid, is they went nuts. They bought into some radical thinking that's crazy. And most of this is because of Munster and the Peasants' War, which, it was political anarchy, and we'll talk about those things. But that's what the label Anabaptist was used as. And by the way, the People's Temple that was led by Jim Jones, that eventually culminated in Jonestown and all that mass murder and that suicide, they claimed to be practicing apostolic socialism, which is still what some of the Anabaptists will say today. They'll call it Christian socialism, or they'll say apostolic. And they had Marxist leanings. So that's interesting stuff. You still see these threads of fanaticism that crop up that find identity in the Anabaptists and in that tradition. I will say this too. One of the stories, the Munster story that we will talk about in the second session, rivals Jonestown in terms of its shock and its scandal. In fact, saying it rivals it makes it sound like it's comparable. It blows Jonestown out of the water. It's insane, and we'll talk about it. But the Anabaptists, the socialism and the proto-Marxism amongst Christians, not that they're advocating for the society to be that way necessarily, but the church at least. They claim that to be apostolic. They pull that from having all things in common in Acts 2 and 4, and that's a big part of their identity. In fact, that desire to be apostolic it's one of the defining characteristics. They have this mindset of returning to what they view as this simple, golden age, pure church right after the apostolic era or during the apostolic era. This simplicity of doctrine and life that they perceive existed there. Now that's false. There is no golden age in the church. Even the apostolic church you see in scriptures, they got some problems that the apostles had to deal with, and that's why we hear about terrible sins in Corinth and then the 7 churches in Revelation. There's lots of sin going on. There's no golden age in the church, but they have that sort of idea of the apostolic church, and they like that apostolic idea. In some cases, they want to return to a socialistic community that they think existed back then. So they do this. And the Amish and the Hutterites, a lot of them are socialistic within their communities. Sort of communistic, socialistic, it depends what you mean. But you can see videos of Hutterites going to their hall, whatever their communal hall is, and getting like daily food rations. And the Brotherhof that I talked about, like nobody gets paid, everybody works, but they have all things in common. And they call it socialism. So they have that golden age perception of the church. And you can see it in the name of the church that we grew up in, Apostolic Christian Church. We're the apostles, right? They're trying to articulate that idea. And you would hear them do that. Even when it came to arguing against doctrines that they don't agree with, they would claim, well, we just want a simple faith. That's a simple faith. And they'll accuse you of overly complicating things, overly deep, overly defined doctrine, stuff like that. And as I remember when I was becoming Reformed, and I was getting a little bit more vocal, I guess, and I was still Anabaptist, so I was going there. Somebody sat down with me, and they warned me, like, well, I said something about wanting to get into the meat. Why all this milk? All you ever hear about is this doctrine of repentance. There's more to the Christian faith, right? Not that that's unimportant, but let's get past the milk and into the meat. And he's like, well, if you get into the meat, you might get into the bone. And I was like, oh, okay, is that bad? What's the bone? He never explained to me what it meant. I still have never reached the bone and chipped a tooth or anything on doctrinal bone. So, but that's the idea that was present enough for him to sit me down and like talk to me about it. Like, stop getting into it too much. Stop getting into doctrine too much. In fact, there's, in some of them, like if you bring a Bible to church, or you have like a carrying case and you bring it to Bible, it's like, that's a warning sign that person is getting too into Scripture and getting rebellious. Like what we've built is not good enough for them. That sort of idea. And I'm not saying that's super prevalent in our church, but it was in some of them. If you brought your own Bible to church, it's like, what are you doing? Like, you reading that a lot? Now, they talk about reading it a lot, but they don't have a high view of Scripture. It's a weird thing about them. They talk about having a high view of Scripture. They don't practice a high view of Scripture because to them, like, everything's gray. You can't understand it. You'll hear them talk about like how they can barely understand any of it. And the parts they do understand, though, it's the law. The things they ought to do. This intense literalism on certain things. It's very nitpicky and like, which ones are they going to take literally? Which ones are they going to understand and take very seriously? So I think it's fair to say that they are apostolic primitivists. This idea of being apostolic. Apostolic primitivists, they're trying to recover the primitive apostolic church. That's part of what they view as what they're doing. We're returning to what they were in the apostolic era. But that name, Anabaptist, it was used slanderously amongst the Reformed, and it was used polemically. And if you were not part of the establishment, or if you were doing something that another group didn't agree with, they might call you Anabaptist, intentionally to try and harm you, to try and smear you. When the particular Baptist arose in England, and they were writing published, or they had pamphlets published against them, and they were calling them Anabaptists, and they were trying to imply that this group in England, they're going to try and grow up, and they're going to overthrow the king and set up their own community and make us all be Anabaptists. And so they're trying to make the particular Baptist out to be Anabaptists. So when the particular Baptists wrote their first confession in the 1640s, they titled it, "The Confession of Faith of Those Churches Which Are Commonly, Though Falsely, Called Anabaptists." That's what they titled their confession. We are not Anabaptists. Granted, we are different than you, but we are not Anabaptists. And likewise, and I don't think a lot of people know this, but in the first edition of the Institutes, Calvin had to say that he and the Huguenots, the Reformed in France, were not Anabaptists. He got accused of it even. And that's obviously not because they were Credo Baptist, it's because They were upsetting the established church in France. And so they got accused of being Anabaptists. People were trying to associate them with rebellion and anarchy and upsetting the establishment. So all of that stuff that I just said, like that sort of thing is glamorized in like modern entertainment culture and in our college campuses. But in the Reformation era, in the 16th, 17th century, that sort of thing was despised and it was genuinely feared. Because when that happened, that sort of thing happened, people died. Because when it happened, it created movements and people died. Now, if it happens on a large enough scale today, yeah, it still happens and people will die. But people feared it. It was a thing that could actually happen. So the accusation of Anabaptist was used to incite opposition to some other Reformed-minded groups. It happened to our forefathers. It happened to the Reformed forefathers even, though not as much. The Roman Catholic Church used them as the example of this is the logical conclusion of what happens in the Reformation. This is what's going to happen. You might even say that the Anabaptists almost ruined the Reformation. Medieval sacramentalism, Roman Catholic sacramentalism, I say it's like heroin in the sense that you can't stop an addict cold turkey. It's actually a little bit dangerous. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but you have to wean them off of that. And Europe was like that a little bit with bad religion. You had to wean them off, and unfortunately, it couldn't be immediately reformed. You had to wean this continent off of bad religion. And so some of the reforms took a bit longer, and I think it was necessary that it took a bit longer. Not that it was ideal, but that's what happened. So the sacraments, for instance, they don't get fully reformed for about 100 years, until after the 95 Theses. It's not until the 17th century that you see the sacraments getting fully reformed. So Luther partially reforms the Lord's Supper, gets rid of transubstantiation. He partially reforms baptism a little bit. He partially reforms church polity. And then the Continental Reformed and the Presbyterians reform it a little bit more. Granted, they bring it along, but it's the particular Baptists that came in and finished the job. I really think we did. We finished the job. We fully reformed all those doctrines, and we got it right, I would argue. So, our understanding of consistently fencing both sacraments, we fence them the same way. It's for people that profess faith. It's for believers only. It's a means of grace. Those are Baptist distinctives, Reformed Baptist distinctives. From Luther to the Reformed Baptists, they kind of got closer and closer to the biblical understanding. They finally got there. And that's where I do find a little bit of sympathy for some of these original Anabaptists, because they wanted reform, but they wanted it too quickly in a way that was just unrealistic. I mean, if we're being generous, we might say that they were ahead of their time in small regards, just small regards in terms of like the holiness of what a church is supposed to look like. Like they understood what they were seeing in Europe. It didn't make sense. Like these people aren't Christians. Why do you keep calling them Christians? But that sort of shaped their trajectory in a negative way, because they became a holiness movement because of that. But they were demanding this sort of change, and they do deserve credit for seeing the need for that change, but they don't deserve credit for doing it the right way, because they didn't. They didn't get there the right way. They wanted religious liberty, for instance. Immediately, though. They wanted it immediately. It was just never going to happen. You're not going to get rid of sacralism in the state church that fast. It's just not going to happen. Now, how much do you criticize somebody for wanting something too quickly? That's just part of where they deserve a little bit of credit, believing and wanting religious liberty. They wanted separation of church and state. Not necessarily in the secular sense. They didn't want a secular society, but they wanted liberty for themselves to practice their faith as they saw fit. And they were persecuted minorities, so of course they did. Any persecuted minority is going to want that. And also, in isolated pockets where Anabaptists did get the majority, where they did get in power, and they weren't a minority in this little pocket, they were not so quick to grant permissiveness in religious liberty at all, religious freedom to others. They didn't practice it themselves when they got the chance. Confessional Presbyterians, they take a while, right, to abandon the idea of a state church. It wasn't really until they saw that sacralism was not going to fly in the newly democratic-minded Americas, right? And they finally abandoned it, and they changed the Westminster Confession to sort of, brush that aside. No more sacralism in the Westminster Confession. We had it right all along, but, they had to change theirs. But I know we can find significant flaws like that for every group of reformers, but the Anabaptists are simply more complicated. and they're more flawed. They have, like I said, a ton of low-hanging fruit by which you can criticize them. Now, generally speaking, in my opinion, I would say they are the most embarrassing aspect of that era. Some of them were not as bad as the rest, but overall, they're still trending negative. There's not a whole lot of good things to look at. I saw one historian raise the question. He said, well, were they heretics? Were they fanatics? Were they saints? And I honestly, I think the answer to that is heretics, yeah. Some of them were heretics. A lot of them were heretics. Fanatics, yes, without a doubt. Yes, some of them were fanatics. And then saints, yes, some of them were saints. And you can even have sympathy, especially amongst some of the original ones, because they're so untaught themselves. You can understand how they fall for stuff a little bit easier. So that answer really, it hasn't changed for 500 years. You still see heretics, fanatics, and saints amongst them. Although I think the proportions have changed a little bit. You don't see as many fanatics amongst them anymore because most of them, they got themselves killed or died out, sort of naturally. So there's less fanatics that endured. But remember, they're not Protestant. They are not Protestant. They wanted radical change, and they wanted radical change in a good way and in a bad way, both. But in seeking that change, it's helpful to think of them as like non-magisterial reformers. The reformers we know and love were magisterial reformers. They were doing it in partnership with the secular authorities, the princes, the city councils, the magistrates. And I'm not saying that's ideal, but they were generally right when they were doing it. The things they were pushing for were improvements. And that pushed the Anabaptists to the fringes even more because they have no partnership with any of that. And I'm not saying they're wrong in doing that. I'm just saying this is what happened. And this is a generalization, but the magisterial reformers were thinking in terms of reforming the institutional church and entire nations, bringing nations along, getting them out from under Roman Catholicism. Whereas the Anabaptists are kind of thinking in terms of each individual person and each individual local church being allowed to do as they please and reform as they please. And it's not like one is right and the other is wrong. They're both right in a sense, but it led to different practices, I guess. Now, not because it's not that the Anabaptists didn't want large-scale reform or something like that, but they had no confidence in what they saw as Christendom to do that. They didn't have any confidence in the reformers or the civil authorities or the societies that they saw these reformers operating in. And I think there's reason for that that's understandable, that I'll explain a little bit later, I think, but that's what they saw. And they weren't wrong in seeing, like, these are not a Christian people, necessarily. They weren't wrong in seeing that, or seeing the clergy that is not Christian, acting not Christian. They saw it and they hated it. And they're not wrong in that. But they did have a narrower view that was focused on just them, essentially. They're not looking to change nations and that sort of thing. They were looking to affect their small band of followers. And there were fanatics that wanted to change their city and country and eventually the world, but they didn't really last. So as some countries reformed, and the alliances basically of entire countries would switch, the individual people didn't immediately believe good doctrine. The clergy that was like a Roman Catholic priest one day and then a Reformed pastor the next, they didn't just become Reformed all of a sudden. Some of them were, they weren't converted as Roman Catholic priests, and they did not become converted when the nation around them and the church around them reformed. So that sort of thing, when there's like a 180 that quick, these people weren't getting saved necessarily. So there's still a lot of bad clergy and people that go to state church, they baptize their babies into it. Sacralism, I lay that at the feet of sacralism, really. This state church idea, because these people are viewed as Christians because they grew up in it. But there's not actually a ton of conversion, because that sort of thing takes time. It takes years and generations of preaching the gospel to convert entire nations and an entire continent like that. But the Anabaptists saw that these people aren't actually Christian, and this idea of Christendom is there, and they criticized it. They used it as a point of criticism for the entire Reformed. Like, they laid it at the feet of the Reformed as if the Reformed could have done anything about that. They couldn't. You preach the gospel and it takes time. You let the conversions happen. But sacralism is what put that label of Christian on this unchristian world. The state church did that. And the Anabaptists used it as a talking point against them, I guess. Reformed morality and ethics took time to pervade into the church because it has to come from genuine gospel preaching and teaching. That's how you convert a people, not from just forcing it as part of your culture. That doesn't work. So even though they deserve some credit for rejecting immorality that they saw, we have to acknowledge that many of them were unhinged. They were detached from historical orthodoxy, and for that, they deserve scorn. They do. They were detached from historical orthodoxy. And because of that detachment, they fell into severe doctrinal error. And they still have severe doctrinal error. Or it might be better to say they never abandoned the error, that the heart of the error that came out of the medieval theology, particularly the soteriology of the medieval church. They just never abandoned it. They stopped being Roman Catholics themselves, but the heart of what they believed was the same. They got rid of the Pope and the traditionals and the sacraments. But the heart of what they understood of how things worked was the same. I've used this illustration several times, and I think it seems to help people. So all too often, people think of the Reformation as like this linear scale of like the Roman Catholic Church is here, and then the Lutherans reformed it a little bit. And then the Reformed, the Continental Reformed kind of made more progress. They brought it along. Then the Puritans brought it along even farther. They're reforming it farther. You're getting farther down the line away from Roman Catholicism. But it was the Anabaptists that, it leapfrogged them all. They're the farthest on this scale, the absolute farthest away from Roman Catholicism. They reformed the most. They're the radical Reformation. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's more like a horseshoe. If you think about it like that, you got the Roman Catholic Church, and the Lutherans do reform it a little bit. And the Puritans reform it, and the Continental Reformed, and I would say even the particular Baptists, they reform it all the way. But the Anabaptists actually come back around. And then they're not that far away. They're different, but they come back around and start mimicking Roman Catholicism and its errors and traditionalism in weird ways that they're pretty hard to predict. So they traveled the furthest in sense of reformed, but they didn't get the furthest away from the Roman Catholic Church that they're trying to reform from. So if you think about it like a football player, you hand it off and he runs sideways and maybe back into the backfield a little bit. And in the end, he's tackled on the other side of the field, but he's only gained 1 yard. He covered, 50, 60 yards running around, but he doesn't make progress towards the goal. That's sort of what the Anabaptists did. They changed it. They covered a ton of ground. They just didn't make any progress. So it's not that great, You don't get credit for the ground you cover, you get credit for the progress you make, and they didn't. So they weren't the most progressive reformers. They don't make the most progress. They were a bit regressive. In terms of their fellow reformers, they were regressive. They parallel Roman Catholicism in odd ways. They continue this medieval anti-clericalism and holiness movements that came from this area of Swiss Germany that traditionally happened in the 12th and 13th centuries. If you've read about the Heinrichians or the Petrobrusians, there's an anti-clericalism movement, and they're really in that vein a little bit. So they're anti-Roman Catholic, but they're not making progress in terms of biblical doctrine a whole lot. They have a similar level of unbiblical idiosyncratic traditionalism as Roman Catholicism, but without the Pope, without the sacramental system. But they're both inherently Pharisaical. The Roman Catholic Church and Anabaptists are inherently Pharisaical. So think of it this way, like Roman Catholicism, they took this empty black box. They got a black box. You could put anything in it, and they filled it up over time with all sorts of man-made traditions and heretical inventions. And they just put them in this black box. And then they get out a label maker, and they put this big label, they slap a label on it that says tradition on this black box. And you can put anything in it. And they didn't have to defend the traditions in the box. They defend the box itself as tradition. So if you can defend tradition, then whatever's in the box is by default defended. So that's what they did. You can add or take away from that box as you see fit. As culture changes, you can change things. You can be as idiosyncratic as you want. You can make up whatever you want as long as you put it in that box and call it tradition. It's defended. And you do that, you enforce that tradition concept with the authority and the power of the church, and that's what they did. The power of the keys, right? The power and the authority of the church. And you can add and take away from it. You just open that lid, you throw it in. Some papal infallibility, boom, it's in there. It's tradition. Marian dogmas, boom, put it in there. Open that lid, it's tradition all of a sudden. And then defend tradition. Don't defend Marian dogmas, defend tradition. Defend the authority to do it. And they never have to show there's historical doctrine in there. They never have to defend it from the Bible because it's tradition. And that's the thing, right? Tradition. And look here in the Bible. The Bible talks good about tradition. It says tradition's a good thing. It's spoken of positively. So submit to that tradition. And if you don't, then we'll use the power of the keys to excommunicate you for not holding this tradition the Bible talks positively about. And oh, by the way, there's no salvation outside the church. So you better submit to it. You see how that concept of traditions can be twisted to become traditionalism. Now, when the Bible talks about tradition, it's talking about like Christian love and the doctrines it actually teaches. That's the tradition it's actually talking about. And it does speak negatively of tradition several times. In fact, more often than it speaks positively, but you can cherry pick. But you see how powerful that can be for an authoritarian church. Well, the Anabaptists come along and they like that black box with the label tradition on it. They love that box, but they don't like what's in it. So they open it up, they dump everything out. But they're like, hey, this box though, that's a pretty nice box. I'm going to keep that box. And they take it and they just start putting in their own stuff. They dumped out the Pope, they dumped out the Marian dogmas, and they dumped out, the magisterium, but they operate with their own magisterium. And they start inventing their own traditions, putting them in that box, and they treat it the exact same way because look what the box says. It says tradition on it, and tradition is good because the Bible says it's good, so do it. And if you don't, you're too proud and you're rebellious. You might not be a Christian. In fact, we might exercise the power of the keys to excommunicate you. And by the way, there's no salvation outside of this group. In this church, there's no salvation outside of it. So they do the exact same thing. They just invented new idiosyncratic traditions. Like, hey, you can't have a beard. No, you have to have a beard. You can't have jewelry. You have to marry in our church only. You have to dress this way. No, you can't wear colored shirts. No, you can't use technology. No, you can't have 2 pins in your collar. Your hat bill has to be straight. Unless you're a Hutterite, then it can be curved a little bit. You can make up anything. Your jeans are worldly. And those khakis you're wearing look too close to jeans. The inseam that are on your khakis, I see that same inseam on jeans, and that's worldly. So don't you dare wear those to the singing because that you're clearly proud. You have a hard heart, and you might get kicked out of the church. I mean, make up anything, put it in that box, defend it. You don't have to defend it from Bible. You don't have to show that it's scriptural. You have to defend the box, and the church authority enforces that box. That's how it works. They did the same thing. They parallel Roman Catholicism. Covered a lot of ground, but they're right there next to them doing what they did with the Pharisaism. You have to pray this way. You have to live in our community. You have to wear these kinds of dresses. You can't do this with the civil magistrates. I mean, again, you can go on and on. You can't have buttons on your clothes. You have to have hook and clasp only. You can't take pictures. That's vain adornment if you wear that sort of thing. That's a graven image if you have a picture of your family in your house. The list goes on and on and on, but you have to submit to those traditions. And look here where the Bible says tradition is good. So, they did the fundamental same concept of traditionalism as the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't reform away from it, they just reformed the traditions to be different traditions. And it looms large. So yes, the Anabaptists are less formalized in the way that they mimic Roman Catholicism this way. They don't have, big books on it and hundreds of years of it developing into that, but they never abandoned the medieval error. They just mimicked it. They elevate their man-made laws to the same level as God's laws, but they don't even begin to grasp the audacity of doing that. Like, we look at that as a serious thing. Like, you cannot make something up and equate it to what God says you have to do. That's a serious error. They don't even begin to grasp that. There really are 2 postures that tradition can bring. One is Catholic, in the sense of unifying, universal. Again, small c Catholic. And one of them is schismatic. Your tradition can bring you into the Christian history and Christian faith, or it can make you distinct from it in a schismatic way where it creates division. And that's what we see happening. It can unite or it can divide. And Anabaptists have used their traditions to be extremely schismatic, even amongst themselves. I mean, the things that you will see Anabaptists divide over, it would make you laugh if it wasn't such a serious thing. because it can be so incredibly arbitrary and meaningless, but they'll divide over it. They will divide, and those divisions will divide. And I mean, I could tell you story after story of how this has happened. And most of the Hutterites are because of Jacob Hutter, and Jacob Ammon is the Amish, and those divisions happened because of silly, stupid things. And I'll call it that because that's what it is. Hopefully that's not an ugly word I'm not supposed to say. I remember I was in one of Dr. Renahan's classes on seminary. He quoted, and he adamantly agreed with John Owen, saying that Christian liberty was the second principle of the Reformation. And that's really, I mean, at first glance, the Anabaptists, they look like they're all about Christian liberty, right? Leave us alone. Let us practice our liberty. But in the end, they don't practice Christian liberty because they implement a mutant version of it that ironically paralleled the Roman Catholic Church that they despised so strongly. They're no less dogmatic about their traditions that they invented ex nihilo from Roman Catholicism is, the way they are about theirs. Because Christian liberty was meant to be a way to protect the church from man-made inventions and worship. That's what Christian liberty was all about. Protecting the church from the church making things up. Protecting the people from the church making things up and implementing it on them. And that's not what they did. They did the exact same thing the Roman Catholics did. And it has not been applied. Their idea of Christian liberty is not applied to individual Christian conscience. It's really not. It was meant by the Reformers to be a restraint, and they have used the same thing to be insular, be withdrawn, and be authoritarian about their traditions. So they've ignored the restraint, and they've imposed their own version of traditionalism. I think one of the reasons that the early Anabaptists may look unrecognizable in the face of the modern image is because we have of this, like the Amish and the old order Mennonites and stuff like that. Is those traditions took time to develop. If you look at them in the 16th century, you don't see Amish and Old Order Mennonite. It took time to develop into that. But the trajectory for it to become that was set back then. So it was almost inevitable. Their mentality and their priorities were established then that developed them into that. And that's, I guess it's only fair for some of the Anabaptists again, but that's what I cover a little bit right now. I want you to see how diverse they were initially, how that junk drawer label applies. And I thought we'd get here a little bit sooner, but I guess here we are. I just want to cover a few of the good Anabaptists before we take a break. We're going to take a look at the Swiss Brethren and Michael Sattler, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll get into some of the uglier sides of the early Anabaptists. So the Swiss Brethren they came up in Zurich under Zwingli. They were reforming right along with Zwingli in the 1520s, mid-1520s, and they were known as the Swiss Brethren. And there were other fanatical Anabaptists in Germany that Luther had to deal with, like the Peasants' Revolt and the Peasants' War and Thomas Müntzer and stuff like that. I think I'm going to have to skip past them. But there were three main figures amongst the Swiss Brethren. There was Felix Manz, Conrad Grebel, George Blaurock. These are the guys that came up under Zwingli and were reforming, right? They're part of the Reformation in Zurich. And we presume that they were reforming and going along with all the stuff that was happening, which was generally good in that city. But then, they're questioning these practices, and they start tearing stuff out of churches, like the pictures and the organ and things like that. And eventually it comes to baptism, and these guys are like, hey, we don't see this in the Bible either. And Zwingli, you told us if it's not in the Bible, let's not do it. Well, let's stop doing it. And Zwingli doesn't really know what to do with it. At first, he's kind of like, oh, I don't know. He's kind of sympathetic, like, let's talk about it. But eventually, he's like, oh, I can't go along with this. And he opposes them. And he like, on behalf of the city council, kind of argues against them. And it becomes this illegal thing. And they try and force the Anabaptists to stop being Anabaptist, which they started calling them that right away. The baptism they were practicing, they would like wet a rag and wipe their face. Like, that's kind of how they baptized each other. So it wasn't like immersion. They weren't Baptist in that sense. But they try and pose these civil things against them to stop them, and it's just, it doesn't work, of course. And then when they keep doing it, they sort of have to follow through with these laws that they made, almost like Nebuchadnezzar. He's like, well, I don't want to punish Daniel, but here we are. What do we do? I made this law. And they're kind of stuck in that sort of situation, and persecution starts, suppression starts. And it's violent, and it's horrible, and it's unjustified, and it's a smear. It's a blot on the history of the Reformed Church, or the Continental Reformed at least. So Conrad Grebel, he leaves. I don't know if he got kicked out necessarily, but he leaves Zurich, and he preaches surrounding areas, but he gets arrested, and then he escapes a few months later, but he dies of the plague in like 1526. And this is all happening in the mid-1520s. Felix Mons was one of the first ones martyred in January 1527. So again, you hear those dates, it happened pretty quick. He received what was sadistically called a third baptism, which was you were drowned in a river. So they would tie you up, put your hands and your knees together, and they'd put a stick between there, and they could hold you under the water, and once you're dead, they could pull you out a little bit easier, and they just drowned you in the river like that, and they called it a third baptism. They're being kind of sadistic that way. Blaurock was with him. He doesn't get drowned. He kind of gets driven out. I'm not real sure why he was allowed to leave, or he gets rearrested and rebanished over multiple times. So it's sometimes it's hard to tell why one of them is killed and why others are just beaten or driven away. It's not super clear. But 1529, he became a pastor of a church, and their previous pastor was burned at the stake. And then later that year, Blaurock is arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake by Roman Catholic authorities. So Roman Catholics killed a lot of them, really. It's hard to feel anything but sympathy for these guys. These guys were, they were different. They weren't there's no record of heresy amongst them. They just seemed to be like discovering credo baptism, and that was the big thing that set them apart. So it's hard to tell. It really is kind of hard to tell, but it's hard to have anything but sympathy for them because of this. So I always wonder, how useful to the church would they have been had they been given the freedom to mature in the Reformed faith? If Zwingli would have taken them under his wing, defended them, and helped them along in certain ways. Not that they should have, gone along with infant baptism, but mature in the Reformed faith instead of being pushed to the outskirts where the tradition begins going off the rails. They don't have time to go off the rails. They all get killed too quickly, honestly. But you almost wonder, would they have developed in a sort of Reformed Baptist? They had the Reformed roots. They were becoming Baptistic, at least in terms of credo baptism. Could they have developed into Reformed Baptists? We almost could have found our heritage there. It could have been like a Puritan-like movement amongst the Reformed, and that could have potentially spread throughout Europe. So there's a bunch of what-ifs that go through my head about them. It's really hard to tell, though, on things like justification by faith alone. What did they believe about it? You don't find a lot of writing or speaking about it. You kind of assume, if they're with Zwingli and they're affirming that part and they're not battling about that, then, okay, they must have believed it and understood it. But why don't they make that part of their tradition? Why didn't they bring that in and make that such a distinct doctrine? Why didn't they see the importance of that? I don't know. I don't get it. And maybe they would have if they had time. It's really hard to tell. I believe many of these guys will be in heaven, these early guys, these very early guys. I think they'll be in heaven. And we can ask them. And, the funny thing is, they might be side by side with the people that killed them. Because I think they're both Christians, and they made grave errors, but they're going to be restored in this perfect union. And maybe we'll have these conversations. I don't know. I got a lot of questions, though. They seem to have, these three men seem to have some association with another important early Anabaptist named Michael Sattler. And he's really important. He was a former monk. He had briefly visited Zurich, and after he left his German monastery in 1525, again, pay attention to those dates. These are just tiny snapshots, flash in the pan, early Anabaptists. He's best known because he wrote the Schleitenheim Confession in 1527. Schleitenheim Confession is one of the rare confessions of the Anabaptists, and we'll talk more about it tomorrow, I believe. It's not actually a full confession. It's kind of like, these are 7 distinctives that we believe, and they kind of leave everything else out. His life as an Anabaptist is short, though. He leaves his monastery. He was the prior. That means he was second only to the abbot, and he came to Zurich in 1525, just as these Swiss brethren are kind of coming online as Anabaptist. And he seemed to abandon his monastic ideas rather quickly. He studied the Pauline epistles. He comes out of it. He gets married pretty quick. He's expelled from Zurich, though, right along with the other Anabaptists, and he goes to Strasbourg, and in Strasbourg he's received in the home of the reformer Wolfgang Capito. And with Capito is Martin Bucer, who you guys may have heard of. These are good reform guys, and he's received into them, and they have all these interactions with him. And that's really interesting stuff. But in 1527, just 2 short years later, he too was captured by Roman Catholic authorities in Austria. He's going to be the last guy that I cover before we take a break. I'm so sorry that it's going so long. But at his trial, he's captured by Roman Catholics, and he's mostly charged with these heresies against the Roman Catholic Church, which are not heresies. And he says, well, show me my error from scriptures. And they're like, well, no. The hangman, he'll debate with you. And so the soldiers, they're guarding him and they're mocking him as they're waiting for the verdict, and it's returned in like an hour and a half. It didn't take long. And they read the verdict, and it said, Michael Sattler shall be committed to the executioner. The latter shall take him to the square, and there first cut out his tongue, then forge him fast to a wagon, basically tie him to a wagon, and there will be glowing iron tongs. So this is the thing that they did. They put iron tongs on the fire till they're glowing red hot, and twice tear sides, pieces of his body, then on the way to the site of the executioner 5 times more, as above, and then burn his body to powder as an arch heretic. The Roman Catholic Church does not mess around with their executions. They exemplify horrific barbarity. There's a low-budget movie called The Radicals that tells the story of Sattler and his wife. It's really interesting if you want to watch it. It's really low budget, but it's hard to find, so if you want to link to it, let me know. But it's one of those that has like really rosy treatment of the Anabaptists. But throughout this drawn-out execution, Sattler reportedly was preaching to the crowds throughout it. He knows what's in store for him, but he's preaching all the way to his death. Even after they tear out his tongue. And he asked the crowds to intercede for the judges, that judged against him. And they're present there, and he addresses those judges directly. And they tied him to a ladder and threw him into the fire. And as he's like being burned, or right before it, he prayed, Almighty, eternal God, thou art the way and the truth, because I have not been shown to be in error. I will, with thy help on this day, testify to the truth and seal it with my blood. And as he's burned, he prays and he sings. It's a rough one. It's a rough one to read about. And his hands were tied. And after a while, the ropes that were binding his hands, they burned through. And he's able to raise his hands, that give that traditional sign of peace. And he did that, I guess, with some of his last power. And he finally prayed, Father, I commend my spirit into thy hands. And brutal execution. And then 2 days later, his wife is also executed, though they mercifully drowned her. But you can see this narrow window of time that all this stuff happens very early on. It's, within just a few years, these main figures are dead or gone. They're the earliest recognized Anabaptists, really, and they're all dead in just a few years. And you see a lot of these deaths in the 1520s. A lot of barbaric ones. And it's not like Sattler. It's not real known what he believed, what his views of the actual gospel were. He was more of a holiness reformer, which of course it was needed. He saw the immorality, he wanted holiness. And we know that Bucer and Capito that he interacted with in Strasbourg, they said positive things about him. He also seemed to be aligned with the Swiss Brethren, and they were probably pretty orthodox, and there's some virtue there. And it's hard to say, though. It says, like the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia says things like he questioned the Lutheran doctrine of justification and also held works to be important to man's salvation. Okay, well, what does that mean? That raises more questions than it answers, right? I mean, why did they say that? What did he disagree with specifically about the Lutherans got justification right? So what issue does he have with Lutheran justification? And what's it mean that works are important? Okay, well, yeah, they're important. Well, in what sense? As a sign that you've been saved or to get saved? That matters. That's a big difference. So we have all these questions about it. I mean, we don't necessarily know. It's unclear, and it's really frustrating to hear that. But these Reformed guys, it said that they had discussions in the spirit of brotherly discipline and peace. So they got along. They didn't agree. They acknowledged they didn't agree, but they did get along. And Capito said this of Sattler. He said, "This Michael is known to us here in Strasbourg, and he was somewhat in error." So he writes a commendation of him, essentially, I think after he got arrested at one point. I don't know if it's to the Roman Catholics, but he's like, he was somewhat in error, which we showed him through the scriptures, but since he saw a lack in our preachers and preaching of the true doctrine, especially on the outward life of the congregation, you see that. He recognized the lack of holiness amongst the church and the people. He saw that. He perhaps paid less attention to our admonition. But at the same time, he showed such great zeal for the honor of God and the church of Christ, which he would have pure and blameless and without reproach to those who are outside. We never censored this, but praised it highly. And they said, yeah, we agree. We see this need for holiness. We agree with that. So they're saying, yes, we praise that. We didn't censor him in that way. But his method and the articles of faith we always kindly rejected. And that after much mature reflection before God. Now, we did not agree with him herein. He wanted, pay attention to this, he wanted to make pious Christians through a fixed creed and outward compulsion, which we considered the beginning of a new monkery. But we desired to correct the life of the believers through consideration of God's good deeds, which he has shown us in body and soul, that it might be a fruit of love and gratitude. For this is the way and the order of salvation. You see that. They all see the lack of holiness. Sattler says, we've got to compel them. We've got to use this new monkery. And they're like, that's law. We prefer to develop that through their gratitude because of what we tell them of what God has done. That's gospel. The Reformed got the gospel, and the Anabaptist wanted the law. And they're using it differently. That's the problem. That set everything in motion for the whole history of the Anabaptists right there. 500 years ago, it was that misunderstanding between law and gospel. They used the law where you're supposed to use the gospel. And they did it out of frustration. They did it because of that lack of holiness, But Bucer said this, though, of Sattler. He said, we do not doubt that Michael Sattler, who was burned at Rottenburg, was a dear friend of God, although he was a leader of the Anabaptists, but much more skilled and honorable than some. So he's saying, he's one of the better ones. We get it. We believe he was a believer, but confused. And it gives me hope. It gives me hope in him, at least. So again, like others, the specifics of the doctrine in regards to justification, salvation, they remain ambiguous, and we're forced to leave it as this open question. We can be optimistic with him, I think, but it's this open question. I should say that Roman Catholics were responsible for 85% of Anabaptist executions. So the Reformed did participate in it, the Continental Reformed, but the Roman Catholics were the ones that really went to town on them. And the number of Anabaptist deaths are dwarfed by the number of Reformed who were killed. So the Reformed are martyred at much higher numbers. The percentages are probably pretty close, but that's just worth pointing out. And in many cases, the Anabaptists were charged with and executed for denying many Roman Catholic doctrines, the same ones that the Protestants were being killed for, but not for being Protestant, necessarily, without being Protestant. And the fact that they were executed with a third baptism, that so-called third baptism of drowning, it shows that there was a genuine hatred. There was a sadistic attitude towards them. Almost like boiling a goat in its mother's milk. There's just something twisted about it. And the people that were executing them were not begrudgingly doing so. There wasn't a sadness that these people are being done away. And we might also point out that since their third baptism was drowning them, it shows that they really did know that baptizo meant immerse. They're not sprinkling the Anabaptists to death. They're immersing them to death. But don't get the impression that the Reformed were out hunting them down. Of all the groups, the Reformed actually interacted with them the most graciously. They killed them the least, which, they shouldn't have been killing them at all, but, such was the times. They could actually survive pretty well if they just kept a low profile in the city. If their presence was known, if they could, it wouldn't be that big a deal unless somebody came along and kind of drew them out, and there was they had to draw a line in the sand or something. There was a public dispensation. They could get banished or something. Hans Dank, for example, was a mystical Anabaptist. He denied justification by faith alone. He became a universalist. And he had a public disputation with Bucer in Strasbourg and then gets banished. Sattler didn't get banished. Hans Dank did. Hans Dank was terrible, Sattler was a little bit more respectable. And before his death from poor health, he was actually taken in Basel by Oecolampadius. If you've heard him, he's a scholarly reformer, and he visited him multiple times. And there's another Anabaptist pretty well known, Pilgrim Marpeck. He was likewise challenged and banished, but otherwise he was treated fairly, and he was requested and he granted additional time to get his house in order before he's kicked out of the city. They want to get rid of him, but they're generally okay, not ruining his life. And he's replaced, he had a civil role in the government, and he's replaced by two other suspected Anabaptists, but they were more tolerated because they just weren't as, vocal as Pilgrim Marpeck. So you can see the Reformed aren't out there headhunting Anabaptists necessarily. They seem to be open to the disputations between them, trying to bring them along, often trying to argue with their leaders, trying to convince them of the truth. And that's something that's worth being recognized in the confusion of that period. Let me skip ahead. There's some stuff about Pilgrim Marpeck, and there was not restraint practiced by the Roman Catholics. They were well accustomed to murdering the saints. Philip of Hesse is somebody that he didn't allow the Anabaptists to be killed. He was he's a ruler in Germany. He was said to show extraordinary generosity and kindness to them. He saw them as a disorder of religious life, which he's right about, had its heirs in weakness and roots in error and in weakness of the faith rather than moral sedition and revolt. And I think he was right there, and he acted accordingly. Let me skip ahead. The one thing though, so they are underdogs, they are persecuted, they are martyred. But it's worth pointing out that being victimized and abused doesn't by default make you a good guy, right? It doesn't make you right because you're basically picked on. I wish our culture understood this. Jews, for instance, they have probably the worst resume in terms of persecution and martyrdom, things that have been done against them, and yet, they hate Jesus Christ. They're not good guys because they're picked on by bad guys. Anabaptists aren't good guys just because they stood up for their convictions. Yes, they were resolute, but they were resolute about false things, often. Being steadfast is great, but doing that while teaching justification by faith plus works is, you're still a heretic, right? If you're burned at the stake for that, it shouldn't have happened, but it doesn't make you right. You're still wrong. Being a martyr doesn't save you. Only faith in Christ saves you. And some people are martyred for faith in Christ, and some people are martyred for other reasons. But here is where the Anabaptist story really gets nuts. It's the hardest part of the preparation here is stopping the reading because it gets insane. We've talked about a few of the good guys, the Swiss Brethren, Michael Sattler. They're pretty good. They're flash in the pan. They're gone pretty quickly. The trajectory is set. It's a pretty negative trajectory. And they're gone a few years, but the trajectory is set. And a movement continues in their name, Anabaptist and Swiss Brethren. But some of these guys, not necessarily Swiss Brethren, but the ones that were Anabaptists, in that junk drawer, they were violent revolutionaries who genuinely deserved death. They should have been put to death. They weren't martyred. They were heretical nut jobs, and they were martyred often for being murderous and awful people. They embodied the sort of radical mysticism that we think of. They were less a part of the Reformation and more an outgrowth of that medieval world that was rife with the revolutionary movements. They wanted to force a twisted version of a utopian kingdom of Christ, and they were more explicit in their denial of justification by faith alone and their views of grace that denied the forensic view of grace and that sort of thing. They either ignored it entirely or they outright rejected it. The five solas of the Reformation do not apply to these guys at all, in the slightest. And they seem to be of a different spirit than the Swiss Brethren. They're not the same quality of men. They're not worthy of respect. And some of these guys I'll just briefly mention. You can read more about them in your free time. Like Melchior Hoffman was like an apocalyptic preacher type. A lot of them are these apocalyptic preacher types. Their whole idea is the end is coming soon, and he had an impact on the Munster Rebellion that we're going to talk about in just a bit. And he had Melchior Hoffman had a strained relationship with the Swiss Brethren, not real sure why. He might have just been too nutty for them. I hope that's why he was convinced that he was like a new prophet Elijah, or Elijah himself. He held to this blatantly aberrant Christology. There was this idea that Jesus had a celestial flesh, not a human flesh, and he did not take his flesh from Mary, so it's like a revival of Gnostic, Docetism type stuff. You see even hints of it in the New Testament, but Menno Simmons, who is like the most influential Anabaptist, he picked up on this, and he said that Jesus passed through Mary like water through a reed. And that's, he doesn't take any flesh from her. We'll talk about him in a little bit. If you get a chance, you could read about people like Balthasar Hubmaier, Hans Hut, Wilhelm Reublin, Jacob Amann. Amann, he's one of the later Anabaptists in the late 17th, early 18th century, but he's significant because he's the one who the Amish are named after. Amann, Amish, that's where it comes from. And he was a split off from the Mennonites obviously from Menno Simmons, in the 1690s. But the split was over what we would call trivial issues. And it's going to sound silly to us, but he had stirred this controversy because he had instituted foot washing, and he was pushing for a uniformity of dress. That's always a thing with them for some reason. And he started practicing communion twice a year. Okay, so he had excommunicated some church members who were unwilling to say that it was wrong to attend services at the state church. So because they wouldn't say it, or because they didn't want to say it immediately, he excommunicated from them. And he didn't even have any authority to do that. I mean, he was in no position, like literally within the church, he had no position or authority to do it, but he did it. And the main issue with his fellow Mennonites is they were just too slow to agree with him. That's it. And on the details and the practice of shunning and excommunicating people, they were too slow to agree with how he wanted to do it, so he excommunicated them. Because of that you see that idiosyncratic traditionalism, right? It's cropping up. It starts to play a role. They wanted more time to discuss it with their churches. Amann says no, he excommunicates them. No authority to do it. That causes the division. He later excommunicated himself for acting so rashly, so he kind of like repents for it, excommunicates himself. Still thought he was right, but he's like, well, I acted too rashly even though I was right. But that division that he created just lasted forever, and the Amish and the Mennonite, followed two different streams from then on out, although very, very similar. So it never really healed that division. But it highlights another historic Anabaptist characteristic, that is extreme sectarianism. It's like they branch off and they split over silly, silly things. Like I mentioned, those 7 main branches, each branch they can't get along within themselves. Like when I talked about the AC Church, the AC Nazarene, the AC America, Apostolic Christian Church America, and the Nazarene, it was because of the facial hair thing. And then there's a German AC Church, and that has to do with using the German language. Well, how's that a spiritual matter at all? And then there was another recent split, and there's the AC Faith Church, and that was about doctrinal issues, but ultimately it was about how AC are you? How apostolic Christian are you? How Anabaptist are you? And they were like, we want to be way more Anabaptist. And the other one was like, well, I mean, I guess that's okay. But, they're losing a little bit of their identity. And then there's some doctrinal issues in there too about blood atonement for sins after baptism, which the faith church denies. And I still get contacted by people in this church sometimes, and they'll talk to me about it. I mean, it matters. This stuff matters. We'll talk about it more tomorrow, actually. I'm preaching stuff that's relevant to that. But they don't get along with each other. They've split over the silliest things. In fact, that faith church I just talked about is splitting over about like how big your head covering is. If it's worn too much on the back of your head or the top of your head. It's like, what? They're starting to fight about that sort of thing. It was so predictable. Like we knew it would happen, but it's happening. So they divide and they factionalize, and those factions will factionalize. And I mean, even in our own tradition that we came up in, it would get to the point where they'd factionalized to one family worshiping in their own church in their own living room. And that's it. That's the church. That's it, because they broke off from everybody else. And then, well, you can't marry outside of the members of your own church. So what do? Nothing. You die out. So that sort of thing happened. It's crazy. So when they split over the facial hair, an Eastern immigrant came over from Hungary, and he wrote a story of it. And he got to America, and they were like, well, you can't have a facial hair. And he's like, what? Okay, well, that's weird. So he shaves it off. And they let him into the church. And then his wife comes over from Hungary after him, and she had never seen him without a mustache, and it was weird, so he grows it back, and the church excommunicates him for it. And he worked as a carpenter. They wouldn't allow the members of their church to hire him as a carpenter so that he could keep working. And his wife had a baby, and the stress of the excommunication and the trouble with the church made it difficult for her to nurse the baby, and they forbid church members from selling them milk to feed the baby. Over a mustache. Over a mustache. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? It's ridiculous. Idiosyncratic traditionalism, authoritarianly enforced. Look at that box, it says tradition, Crazy stuff like that. And they all sort of have these stories within their branches of these silly things that they fight over. Even amongst the 6 main denominations of Amish, they can tell each other apart by the cut of their clothing, literally, because they all make their own clothes. And that the reference I made about the inseam looking too much like jeans, that's real. That's a real story. Like, that happened in our tradition. And the Amish, like, a woman will tell a story about, they'll pin their collar, but if they put 2 pins, and I'm literally talking about the head of a pin showing on their collar, 2 pins is too many. You're proud. Or if you put 2 pins in your hat, the head of the pin is too worldly. The brim of your hat is curved just a little bit too much. You're proud. It's crazy. It is crazy. And it's that sort of stuff that matters to them. And so they'll do these sort of splits, and it's predictable. It's predictable once they set these things in motion. They have this very divisive nature to them. Now, don't get me wrong, they can be like very kind, very generous people, but they can also be very, very stubborn and obstinate and unreasonably inflexible. And I would say unreasonable inflexibility doesn't always have an antagonistic face to it, Sometimes it's just a quiet, calm face that thinks you're a moron and just don't say anything or whatever. So take this for what it's worth. Many Anabaptists have this Swiss-German heritage, and they have largely remained this rural agrarian people, fairly isolated, fairly insular, and they live these lives intentionally separated from outsiders. And as one having multiple family lines with that background, 99.9% genetically from this little tiny area of Swiss Germany. I've been one myself. I've been surrounded by them my entire life. I can confidently say they are a stubborn, hard-headed people. And again, I don't necessarily mean that as an insult, but that's just who they are. That's kind of how they, not to say they can't be kind and generous, but they are stubborn and hard-headed. It's not easy to convince them of much, even in the face of opposing evidence. And that is a recipe for the preservation of error. So they've been able to preserve error pretty well doing that. They rarely recant, they rarely change their minds on these sort of things. They're not bothered by not fitting in, which, that's fine. That's admirable when it comes to the world, and we don't want to fit in with the world, but it's not admirable when you don't fit in with the historic Christian church. That's not admirable. Those are your brothers and sisters, and the true church, when you're that far off from them, like that's saying something. I also want to mention Jacob Hutterer, because he's the founder of the Hutterites, which is one of those enduring Anabaptist groups that's survived until the present day. He seemed to be influenced by the Moravians, that's sort of Eastern European, and a lot of pietism comes from Moravia. I would love to see some research on the pietistic influences on Anabaptism, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, the Hutterites reflect those socialistic tendencies. Just like the Bruderhof, they have these very socialistic tendencies. They live in these isolated groups, like I mentioned, and they have a communal sharing of goods, daily food rations even. They're probably the most aggressively communal, because Anabaptists are very communal. They almost devalue the nuclear family in how communal they are. Like, your parents aren't what matters, it's the community that matters. They can almost devalue the nuclear family. And some will even ban most private property. They are like the Amish and Mennonite, that they have a uniformity of dress, but they look different than them. They still look old-fashioned, they still look rural, but they'll be more colorful. You'll see patterns and maybe floral prints. Their hats, can be more cowboyish. Almost, they are very rural that way, but whereas Amish, it's straight brimmed,
And Hutterites, they'll be a little bit more curved, so worldly and progressive. So Jacob Hutter and his wife, they were captured by Roman Catholic authorities. He was tortured. He was burned at the stake. His wife escaped while pregnant, but then 2 years later, she was rearrested and drowned. Hans Dank, I mentioned him briefly. He's worth mentioning because he's one of these heretical spiritualist type Anabaptists. He denied justification by faith alone. He became a universalist, yet he's still Anabaptist. He's still he was baptized by Balthasar Hubmaier, and he's allowed to lead this group of Anabaptists in Augsburg, but why? How does this heresy, why don't they care? I don't know, I don't get it. He's put on trial and he's banished by Lutheran authorities. He was asked to present a confession of faith, and you can read that online, actually, Hans Dank's confession of faith, and it's hard to tell what he's saying. You read through it and you're trying to discern, where's this guy at, and it's really hard to tell what he believes, or even if he believes. It's just strange. It's a disaster of a confession, but if you wanted to look that up. Some other Anabaptists were like rationalists. They would lead him to deny the Trinity, becoming Socinian. There was an Anabaptist that survived the Munster Rebellion we're about to talk about, and he became a Mennonite. And then he broke off from them. He started his own group called the Adamites, and they denied the Trinity and the deity of Christ and that sort of thing. But what really gave the Anabaptists their reputation was their fanaticism, this apocalyptic doomsday preaching and fanaticism that became really rampant in the 1520s and 30s. One segment of the Anabaptists very much were a Reformation version of the crazy guy standing on the corner saying the end is near, with the sign on. And many in that day actually did think the end was near, including Luther. They thought the end was nigh. It was such an overturning of the world that they knew. It felt like it was all being turned upside down, and they all kind of thought it was coming close. And even scarier than the apocalyptic preaching of the Anabaptists was they were trying to back it up by claiming actual revelation from God. Basically, God is speaking directly to me. And they were sort of proto-Pentecostal in this way. So you can think of the Pentecostal spiritualism and mysticism. It's still present in the Anabaptists, but they were really bad in terms of pretending to receive direct revelation. And there's no surer sign of an untrustworthy teacher than someone claiming direct special revelation from God. That's someone that you run from. They're surely a false teacher. The principle of sola scriptura that was seen, I think it was seen in the Swiss Brethren. They were practicing it. They were growing into it. That did not endure into the other Anabaptist doctrines and practices. So unfortunately, that died off. The Swiss Brethren, again, one of the reasons they're more respectable is they were sort of trying to do sola scriptura. The other Anabaptists do not. So a distinct mysticism set in, and it's still noticeably present today. Even the apocalyptic Pentecostal inclination of the Anabaptists didn't even last much past the 16th century, but that mysticism did. You see it in the way that we grew up, where they flip open the Bible, and it's whatever they see first, and they preach on it, and it's this mystical idea that the Spirit's just going to the less you know, the more spiritual it is. Same with the marriage. Oh, you don't know that person, and you still, by faith, took that step? Oh, it's so spiritual. It's that sort of mysticism. And they'll look for mystical signs. They see a billboard or a license plate with the name or the first letter of the person's name, that sort of thing. It's a mysticism. But that started setting in. So we see claims of divine revelation from the Zwickau, I always have problems saying their name, Zwickau prophets. They were in Germany. They were teaching this impending apocalypse in the early 1520s. So this is very early on, even before the Swiss Brethren. And they were these spiritual, mystical type Anabaptists. They accused those that held to sola scriptura as being ministers of the dead letter. So they had a very low view of Scripture, obviously. And they didn't technically rebaptize each other, but they did deny infant baptism. So I think it's fair to put them in this camp. You can see the proto-communism mentality. They stirred up class warfare. And this is hard because the feudal system then, it was unjust. It was terrible. It denied men some of the fundamental human rights that we recognize today in the feudal system. And so they're trying to upend that, so they're seen as revolutionaries, and they're not necessarily always wrong about all the bad things happening there, but they very much advance the German in Germany, the idea of like this underclass proletariat, working class being oppressed by the bourgeoisie upper class, this proto-communistic idea, but in society even. And Luther desperately did not want the Reformation to transform into this political civil revolution. So he opposed these guys. He referred to them as the Schwärmei, the enthusiasts. But despite his efforts, the preaching of the Zwickau prophets had influence on Thomas Müntzer and the Peasants' War that came about in the mid-1520s, and that was in Germany. There's an uprising of peasants. And don't mix up Thomas Müntzer with the city of Munster. The pronunciation is probably more similar than that, but I'm going to try to distinguish them too. Munster he was one of these really bad Anabaptist types, some of the worst of the Radical Reformation. Some say he wasn't an Anabaptist, but I mean, he kind of was. It's fair to put him in this category. He had positive interaction with them. He rejected infant baptism. He had socialistic tendencies like a lot of the Anabaptists. He applied it to the civil realm more, and other peaceful Anabaptists seemed content to apply it only to their little groups, the communities they create, and he applied it to the civil realm more. And he was a mystical spiritualist. He was deposed in Germany for his violent radicalism, anti-clericalism. He advocated for the use of the sword. He actually had a standing army. Thomas Müntzer had a standing army, and he eventually used that to become a leader in the peasants' revolt. And to give you an idea how bad he was, he took 2 Corinthians 3:6, where it says the letter kills but the spirit gives life, and he claims this as because Christians now, we have the Spirit. The Spirit gives life, and they no longer we don't need the Bible anymore. That's the letter. The letter kills. The Spirit gives life. And so he called them that, the ministers of the dead letter, like the Zwickau prophets, that idea of like they're preaching the Bible. We have the Holy Spirit, that proto-Pentecostal idea. So he basically rejected the Bible and for further direct experience of the Holy Spirit. And to him, it was just letter, paper, and ink. And he used to say, he would try and mock Luther. He'd say, Luther, Bible, babble, bubble. And Luther would respond to telling Munster, he said, I wouldn't believe you if you swallowed the Holy Spirit, feathers and all. So those two kind of butted heads. Luther on the right side of that one for sure. Luther did side against the peasants in the Peasants' Revolt. So this thing happens in 1524 for 1525. There's not really a good or bad side on the Peasants' War. Sadly, it's just an awful piece of history. They were genuinely unfairly oppressed in the feudal system. They were ruled by these princes and landowners who were unfair to them, and the inherent civil freedoms that we're accustomed to today were not acknowledged back then. And some of the demands of the peasants were not that radical by today's standards. They really aren't. They're almost fair by any unbiased sense of justice. They're fair demands, but they were radical in terms of its historical context. It would have been a giant leap forward in terms of history, and they were unrealistic. That's not to say they're bad. They were unrealistic. And they were violent. The peasants became very violent, very destructive, went on rampages, and that was not at all justified or biblical. So there's not really a good side. Again, being abused and being oppressed doesn't make you a good guy, right? The peasants weren't good just because they were oppressed. Luther did criticize the injustices against these peasants, but he was not all about the upheaval of the social structure that they were advocating for, and he wrote tracts against them. It led to a suppression of them. A lot of them were killed. They were violently put down. Some tried to lay that at Luther's feet. It was already happening. Munster, had the peasants convinced, even up until like the final battle, the day of their destruction, that Christ was going to come and intervene for their victory. And Philip of Hesse had he had a cannons on a hillside, all trained on like where they were. And Munster, sorry, I'm going to keep messing that up. Munster said that he was going to catch their cannonballs in his sleeves and fling them back at them. So I don't think he necessarily meant that literally, but you can still see. He's leading an army of farmhands against an organized professional army. And that gives you an idea of what he was like, right? Pretty bold. So like 6,000 peasants are killed that particular day. And then the professional army, Hess's army, lost like 12 people total. And they found Munster hiding in a cellar. He's captured, he's forced to confess, he's beheaded. And he has become like this proletariat hero for communism. And which, if you ignore some of the religious aspects, I mean, some of that is a legit parallel. I mean, you could kind of put him in that category. Some progressives have tried to turn him into, and honestly, other Anabaptists like him tried to turn him into like a Che Guevara type character, revolutionary that's to be hailed and admired and stuff. But all they're really doing is co-opting their defiance against the establishment to support like Marxist leanings and ideas. So they kind of co-opt the Anabaptists that way. But this socio-religious radicalism was linked to the Anabaptists. Starting in the 1520s at the Peasants' War, they linked them to the Anabaptists, but it's the events in Munster 10 years later that solidify that in the public conscience. And that became, like, this is the thing that Anabaptists, this is why they're in danger. Look at what they do, and it's because of Munster. And I'm not being hyperbolic here when I say Munster is, without a doubt, the single craziest story in church history. It is more insane than every defenestration you've ever heard, where the people are thrown out of windows and things like that. You put all that together, and Munster is just off the charts insane. I can't even begin to put all the detail into it, that it deserves, that every one of them just like, whoa, that sort of thing. It poisoned the well for the Anabaptists for generations to come after that, and later iterations of Anabaptism have a particular different face than the Anabaptist in Munster. Like, this brand of the Anabaptist dies off, but they ruin it for everybody. Like, you can't get any respect. Being Anabaptist from this point on for generations is like, it's a dangerous, horrible thing. But they, so all of them, even the pacifistic ones, bear the repercussions of this violent group in spite of their positions that grew up after this. It's somewhat ironic too, because if you talk to an Anabaptist today, it wouldn't be surprising if they'd never even heard of the Munster Rebellion. But this is the event that defined Anabaptists for the entire Reformation era and explains why they were so despised. I'm not saying this is the character of most of the Anabaptists, although it's more than they'd like to admit, but it's the thing that warned everybody or made everybody think they were so bad. There's a podcast called Hardcore History, Dan Carlin, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. He covered this in like a 4-hour episode called Prophets of Doom. And he it's really good in terms of the data he presents. You should find it. If you need a link to it or have any trouble finding it, let me know. But his book comes out of this eminently readable book called The Taylor King, The Rise and Fall of the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. It's by Anthony Arthur. That one I highly recommend. Again, I've gone over the story so many times, and yet I read that book and my jaw just dropped all over again. There's so much detail of what went on that would blow your mind. Just how dastardly they were, and it's awful. It's awful. Anyway, Carlin, in that Hardcore History podcast, he's secular. He doesn't really understand religious expression very well. His worldview doesn't really know how to handle it appropriately, but he does a good job recounting the raw data of the sources. James White, I think, has covered it a few times as well, and his is pretty good. He doesn't get into as much detail, but I mean, almost nobody can without reading multiple books. We could fill the rest of this day talking about what happened there. It's unbelievable. I'm going to have to give you just like a few of the highlights. And even if half of these reports were true, even if half of them were true, it'd still be off the charts. Insane. So between 1532, 1535, so it's, coming out of the Peasants' War, it's about 7 years later. This is, there's various political, geographical reasons, but this city of Munster, it's technically Roman Catholic, but it's religiously diverse, relatively religiously diverse. There's a lot of Lutherans in there. There's a lot of Anabaptists starting to show up there, and they kind of all got along. But it became a hotbed for Anabaptist radicalism of the worst sort. And the Anabaptists were supposedly prophesying of the impending judgment day in those years. Munster was going to be the supposed epicenter where Christ is going to return. He's going to make Munster the New Jerusalem. There's a guy, the leader in the city called Bernard Rothman. he continually was stirring up radical reform in the city. He held that Anabaptist, the heretical celestial flesh teaching. And Rothman had an ally in the town council named Bernard Knipperdolling. And these two Bernards basically kept the city on this radical edge about to explode. Like, it was getting stirred up. People are becoming Anabaptists. Anabaptists are starting to flock into it. And the explosion that happened was triggered by the arrival of two Johns, or Jans, like Jan, it looks like Jan in English, but John of Leyden, and he comes in 1533. He's like a charismatic, good-looking preacher. He had becoming increasingly Anabaptist, increasingly apocalyptic and communistic, and he sees Munster as the site of the second coming. And following John of Leyden was another John, but I'll call him Jan Mathis, Jan Mathis. And this guy, he looks like a prophet, and he's bald, he's got a beard, he dresses in all black, he's got this pretty attractive younger wife, like 20 years younger. She dresses in all white, and it's like something out of a movie. And Munster is printing this Anabaptist literature, and they're sending it out to the surrounding regions. It's almost like a missionary hub, and it's drawing in more and more Anabaptists, and it's trying to create Anabaptists out there on top of the Anabaptist conversions that are happening within the city. And this convergence of fanatical Anabaptists descending on Munster, and the population demographics start to change over time, and the power dynamics shift into the favor of the Anabaptists, and they start an insurrection. They essentially totally take control of this city. And it's a well-defended medieval city with high walls. It has a double moat. It's really interesting. So it's a really well-defended, and it's a big city. It's almost self-contained and can almost run within itself. And communism begins not only being preached, but enforced communism. Eventually, as you will see, the communist-like structure of Munster produced what it always does, what's all too familiar to modern communistic states. So that's this upper elite that, is feasting, living lavish lives, richly, in the castle being provided for, and then the people and the peasants are literally starving to death in the streets. That eventually happens. But the Anabaptists, they take control of the city. And they had those Anabaptists who were previously pushed to the outer boundaries of society or had to hide in the shadows, they're suddenly emboldened with this new sense of power. And the apocalyptic millennialist mentality started to turn oppressive and violent. To those outside the city, it looks like the Peasants' War is happening all over again. They took over a city and they're doing the Peasants' War thing. I mean, they kind of are, in a way. But it's now centered on that well-defended city, and it has these Anabaptist lunatics with this horde of unwavering followers. Like, they just are fanatically, like, you cannot convince them otherwise. And to give you a sense of what the type of leadership that was being exercised by these men, they were basically strutting around like they're in direct conversation with God. Like, he's just telling them what to do and like speaking to them, but only they can hear it, and then they can dispense it to the people. They're that sort of prophet, that sort of level of audacity. And surprise, surprise, all these messages from God seem to give them absolute authority and very specific directions that are always in line with what they want to happen. Mathis tells everyone they need to kill everybody in the city that's not Anabaptist. Kill them all. But then Knipperdolling kind of convinces them, well, let's just exile them instead. So one morning at sunrise in the dead of winter, snow on the ground, they go around armed with weapons and they kick out all the Roman Catholics. And then, there's like children walking barefoot for miles outside of this city. They don't care. They just send them out. Like, you don't get to collect any of your stuff. Clothes on your back, get out or die, that sort of thing. Horrific barbarity for families having to do this. The Lutherans, they were a little bit more lenient too. They had the opportunity to convert if they wanted to, and they could keep their stuff then if they converted. So Mathis urged the murder of all of those who resisted to avoid the contamination of the faithful. That's a thing in Anabaptists. The church can be contaminated by lack of holiness. And in reaction to this, there's a prince bishop that's in charge of the city. He's a prince and he's a bishop, and he's Roman Catholic. So he puts the whole city under siege. And eventually he builds an entire wall city around the city that has double walls. So there's the city with double walls, really well defended, and outside of it is an entire Roman Catholic army. And actually Lutherans join them because it's so bad inside that they're like, we'll put our differences aside to get rid of these Anabaptists. They're crazy. But they build this, they put the whole city under siege. And for the rest of this story, the city is under siege. And inside of the city, there's this strict communism that's being enforced. Private property and profit are banned. Debts are erased. Book burnings are happening. One of the citizens complained about it at his job. And Matthes hears about that, and he drags him before the entire city. He says, this guy needs to be condemned to death immediately, like right here in the streets. And a couple of the men are protesting, and Matthes is enraged that he's being challenged. They're kind of like, well, we got a process for this. We can go through, have a trial or something. But Matthes is enraged that they question him or even hesitate. And he has them arrested immediately, and they're dragged away. And then Leiden, John of Leiden, so Matthes is the main guy right now. John of Leiden is kind of his right-hand man. He comes forward, he grabs a spear, and he just stabs this guy right in the back, right in front of everybody. And this guy was he was like a big blacksmith guy. He doesn't die. And so he grabs a gun and he shoots him in the head. Still doesn't die. He lived for 8 more days, just like agonizing death. Lives for 8 more days, but they're killing people in the streets for like a defiance or questioning their authority. Soon after this, Matthes collects everyone he thinks is on the fence in regards to like their loyalty and their devotion to his version of Anabaptists, and he locks them up in the church. And after they see this kind of murderous attitude that they have, they're terrified. You want to be on his good side or he's going to have you killed. And he has them held there until he comes in and they're just throwing themselves at his feet, asking for repentance. When can we come back? Because he's in there with armed guards. They think they're going to be butchered. So it creates this sort of fanatical loyalty to him just to preserve your own life. And he acts like God speaks to him, and gives him this pardon because God said so through him. And all this is happening while the city is blockaded by this ever-growing Roman Catholic army. But Matthes has been telling everyone that there's thousands of Anabaptists that they're on their way. They're going to come in. They're going to reinforce us. These hordes are going to be swept away by this oncoming Anabaptist influx, which they were trying to do. They're sending out this material, publishing this material, trying to get it out. And they did that, even tried to sneak it through the lines of the people that have them under siege. But he knew it wasn't going to happen. He's just saying that to kind of reinforce his own authority. And then there's a wedding celebration that's going on. And he goes into this fanatical state, apparently, of receiving some sort of divine revelation. And he's openly speaking to God. And he starts walking around and kissing people. And then he leaves. And the guy was, if he wasn't insane, he does a good job of portraying that he's insane. But then on Easter Sunday, a little bit later, he gets dressed up in full armor, takes about 12 cavalry men with him, and he barrels out of this city to fight the entire army outside of the city that's got them besieged. And he does it. He succeeds. He kills all of them. No, I'm just kidding. He's immediately massacred. Just butchered immediately right in front of them. They're literally standing on the walls watching him do it, and they literally chop him up into pieces. They put his head on a pike. They take his manhood, we should say, and they nailed it to the city gate. These are the sort of things that happened. And the people are shocked. Their prophet is dead. This guy that's been leading them, he's dead. But then John of Leiden, his right-hand man, he immediately fills this power vacuum. He declares himself the king of Munster. So now he's the king, and he says, well, he knew all this was going to happen. God showed him this in a vision. And God punished Matthes for his arrogance, and he had foreseen it, and he watched it happen because Matthes got arrogant. And so he knew it was going to happen. He's the real prophet now. He's the one that's receiving the direct revelation from God, so now he's the man in charge. So John of Leiden is the new man in charge. So a week later, he shows up in the town square, stark naked, just starts running around screaming, claiming messages from God, this sort of nonsense. And he says, the city council's got to go, get rid of the whole city council. And he picks 12 hand-picked men, like 12 apostles, essentially. And he makes them elders, he gives them swords. He starts instituting the death penalty for just about everything. Everybody is then required to leave their doors open on their houses. They can't shut and lock their doors. So he's completely totalitarian about everything. So they can just walk into people's houses and do what they please. And they bear the sword, literally, with them. And they will kill people in the streets. Like just chop off their heads right there in the streets if they feel compelled. Eventually, the outside army, they schedule a time to storm the city. They're going to do it. They're going to finally just, like, enough of this. Let's storm the city, let's end this. But the night before they're going to do this, the soldiers get super drunk. They get so drunk that they wake up in a stupor at night and they think it's dawn, and they haphazardly attacked the city in this drunken stupor, thinking that they just about missed it. They thought they slept through the night. So the Anabaptists easily turned them back. And that emboldens them all the more. You know, they climb up on these ladders, these siege works, and they put their hands, they're trying to climb over the city, and there's women there even just chopping off hands, chopping off heads. They dump like burning hot lime, it burns their skin off, and they're half drunk anyway. And so the Anabaptists are all emboldened, like, look how we turned back this horde, the Roman Catholic horde, and they're just all the more emboldened by it. But the siege goes on, right? And conditions in the city start to worsen. They get worse and worse. You know, even a well-equipped city can only hold out so long. So there's this 15-year-old girl in the city, and I'm just sprinkling in these details. There's so much more to this. But a 15-year-old girl, she comes up with a plan. She's going to surrender to the outside army, and she's going to pretend to be a defector, and then offer to the Prince Bishop a shirt. She's going to kind of try and seduce him a little bit, get alone with him, and she's going to offer him this beautiful shirt that they've soaked in poison, and he'll put it on and die. And I don't know, I guess that's not going to make the army go away, but that was their plan. And the leaders are like, okay, yeah, sure, go for it, do that. I know, that sounds made up. All this stuff sounds made up, but that's what happened. So the plan fails. She's tortured. She's decapitated. And the Prince Bishop has begun to, like, they keep getting these defectors that are coming, and they'll give them false information, and they'll lead them into these traps, and the soldiers will get butchered with supposed secret paths into the city. And so they were doing that sort of warfare against the besieging army. Even at night, the Anabaptists would conduct raids. They'd sneak out of the city, get into the company of the soldiers, and start slitting throats and killing them in their sleep. There was one Anabaptist that would get up on the city walls every morning at the same time, and he would moon the soldiers, like moon them from the top of the wall. And the soldiers eventually, they just get sick of this, and one day they train all their guns where he is every day, and they put an end to it. They put an end to it real quick and just blow him away. So things, they keep getting weirder. There's another supposed revelation received by John of Leyden in the summer of 1534, and it's God commands polygamy. So it's not a choice anymore, it's commanded. And the single women, they start forcing to get married. Even if they are married but their husband's outside the city, they force the women to get married. And because they had this disproportionate, there was like a 3-to-1 women to men ratio. Rothman initially resists this idea with the polygamy, with a few others, but then he's ultimately convinced by the prophetic authority of Leyden. Really, it's his prophetic authority, to the point where he starts publishing defenses of it, and he distributes his theological defense of the practice, and those are still available today. You can read what Rothman said, how to defend polygamy, and they sent out those pamphlets too. And it seems to be totally out of the blue, this polygamy thing. You wonder, is it just like these other cult leaders who take advantage of their power and they want to satisfy their lusts? I think, yes, part of it is definitely that. There's other possible reasons. It might have been motivated because John of Leyden was actually possibly caught in Nipper Darling's house with one of the maids having an affair, cheating on his wife, and so he kind of covered his tracks, like, well, it's actually because I got this revelation from God about polygamy. So, I'm actually obeying God by doing this. So the man who saw that happen, he was actually a deserter from that army. He had come into the city that was besieging. He was in the army that was besieging. He comes into the city, but he wouldn't shut up about it. So was Leyden kind of covering his tracks? We're not super sure, but it may have been that, just kind of covering up his sin. Any opposition, though, was swept away by the unquestioning authority of the prophet. Like, nobody can question this guy. And he's talking to God every day, right? And so how do you question him? And Leyden even took Matthes's young wife, that wife that was 20 years younger, he takes her as one of his, I think he winds up with 16 wives or something, of the ones that he didn't kill. He killed some of them, at least one of them, questioned him. He cuts off her head in the street and then makes the other women start singing hymns as praise to God for her judgment. It's just mind-boggling stuff that happened. But then they force a lot of the other women into marriages, and the stories here, they are graphically awful because, it was teenage kids, and some of them were really young, and they couldn't lock their doors, and they would walk in, and they would force these kids into marriage, and some of them would resist it, and some of them had to go along with it. But there was actually there was a woman that basically nursed a lot of these young girls back to health after the abuse that they received at the hands of their husband, the sexual abuse that, they were just too young to get married, and they were forcing them. Crazy, crazy things. It was horrible. You read these stories, you just want to weep. So and you can't tell the difference between how much of it is just sexual avarice and how much of it is like, some of them were going off the charts with it, but others were like, well, it's not supposed to be this way. It's kind of hard to tell. But resistors are daily decapitated along with other people that sin sexually, like the fornicators and the adulterers, the incest, rape, whatever, unclean sexual sin. They would, kill them in the streets as well. But if you're a resistor, you could as well. There is an internal revolt at one point, but it doesn't succeed. They don't act decisively enough. They kind of hedge their bets a little bit, and so they're repelled or executed. Nipperdalling himself, one of these leaders, he would help with the executing. He would literally cut people in half with his sword. So things are just crazy. And more assaults come from the outside army. They're viciously turned back. They don't succeed. It really is, with a double moat, it's a very complicated city to storm in. And again, they're climbing over, getting cut up, even by the women. They'll throw rocks and heavy objects off the roof, or off the walls, and kill them. So the tactic turns from storming the city to, all right, let's starve them out. Let's just starve them out. Let's just wait and starve them out. And that begins to work. Things deteriorate more and more and more. There's this lame goldsmith, and he proclaims, there's sort of like this staged event where he proclaims that John of Leyden is greater than any prophet. And he's actually the new King David. And Leyden, he's like, the sort of attitude they have is like, Christ is coming back, the epicenter is going to be here, and this movement here is going to spread to the entire world. We're going to take over the entire world, essentially. And so when he gets proclaimed this new King David, he so humbly accepts the mantle, and he starts bearing the sword against all opposition, which he essentially was already doing, but he's trying to justify it now this way. He says his kingdom's never going to fail. He's going to take over the whole world, kill all the godless. And then he appoints a royal court with these special coins and clothes and flags, and he lives like a king in the city with a royal court. He has a royal court, just like a medieval king would. So they mimic that. And in the fall of 1534, he calls out a man personally from the crowd, and he cuts his head off right there in front of everybody to make an example of him. And they're eating fine, his whole court, they're eating fine, but it's communism, so people start starving to death in the streets. They're eating shoelaces, tree bark, grass, slugs. They start digging up graveyards, eating the dead bodies. It gets barbaric. They start killing children, eat some of the children. They're dying left and right. There's mass graves being dug. And Leyden just calls it a test from God. God's just testing it. He says God's going to turn the cobblestone streets into bread before they die of starvation. And so, with their unfailing faith, some of these followers, the unfailing faith to this king and this prophet, they start trying to bite into the stones as an act of faith. And I like to say it this way, they quickly learn that transubstantiation is not only fake news in the mass, it's also fake news in the streets, literally. You're not going to change the nature of what's there. It's fake news. So finally, some of them start to die out, and the city is filled. The outside city or the army outside they report hearing audible moaning and cries, weeping. It's just audible in the city. It's just a death stench is setting in amongst all of them. And eventually, Leyden is feeling this pressure mounting, and he says the army outside the walls is going to be defeated by March 26th of 1535. So he gives a definitive date, which is it's never a good idea for a false prophet to give a definitive date if you want your false prophet status to remain. And then they start sending these men out of the city as apostles in this vain attempt to basically raise even more Anabaptist support to come and help them. But the Prince Bishop has spies inside the city, and a lot of these guys are caught and killed. Some of them were actual defectors that wound up giving independently verified information to the Prince Bishop, so he captures some of these guys and he uses them. But then a few of them do get out, they get past the lines, and they do start these minor insurrections in various locations in other cities where they're trying to stir up Munster-like events in other cities in Europe. And let me take a brief rabbit trail here. I think this is helpful. So these apostles are getting out. So one of these guys gets to Bolsward in the Netherlands. It's just northwest of Munster. And there he led a group of radical Anabaptists to take over a Roman Catholic monastery called the Old Klooster. So he's sort of doing the same thing, but within this city. And they use it as a staging event or a staging area to help the Munster rebellion. They want to raise support and raise armies and weapons, send them to Munster from the Old Klooster in that city. And they want to conquer the entire province around it. And that Old Klooster had to be surrounded and retaken by the governmental troops. I mean, these guys, it wasn't theirs, right? It wasn't theirs. And remember at the beginning when I said some of the secondary historical sources, they're overly generous to the Anabaptists? Well, this little event is a great example of that reality. If you read the Mennonite Historical Atlas, it'll talk about this event, but it talks about it like it's a persecution event, where there's 300 Anabaptists in this as they took refuge in the monastery before they were slaughtered, by the city. Well, that's not what happened at all. It makes no mention of the direct Munster tie, the violence that was happening in Munster, and they're trying to recreate it and support it. It makes no attempt at the violent attempt to take over the province. It's a complete mischaracterization of what happened in the Old Klooster. So the Anabaptists had overrun the monastery. They took over a space that is not theirs, and it makes it sound like the troops just went in and butchered them because they hated them for being Anabaptists and they were just trying to flee to their safety. That's not what happened. The troops were violently resisted when they tried to take it back. The Anabaptists weren't pacifists here. They weren't pacifists in Munster. They weren't martyrs. They were being punished by a civil government doing its job, honestly. The Netherlands, where this happened, was a historic refuge for Anabaptists. They could go there and be safe, but they're not out hunting the Anabaptists, but you can't go there and take over a Roman Catholic monastery and just start supporting this violence. So a good portion of those people even, in that little rebellion, they weren't even killed in the retaking of the monastery. The vast majority of them weren't. Some of them were put on trial. A lot of them were released. Interestingly, some of the folks from Minnow Simmons Church were involved in that, including his brother Peter. Or they were killed in that event, and that he didn't react by saying, "Oh, this is great injustice." Minnow Simmons didn't say, "Oh, this Old Klooster thing is just a butchery of the Anabaptists." It actually triggered him to start openly criticizing and condemning the Munster Rebellion for the first time. It pushes him into a more pacifistic direction. So Minnow Simmons' pacifism is somewhat directed by the Old Klooster event and the Munster event. So watch out for those sources that misconstrue what was going on with the Anabaptists. It calls into question a number of the supposed persecution events. Were they persecution events, or were these people trying to do what happened in Munster? It's going to be hard to tell a lot of times. How many times were the civil government just doing their job? Resisting violent revolts by fanatical zealots convinced they were ushering in the millennium. I don't know. Too many Anabaptist sources are not very honest about the pervasive violence that is genuinely accredited to the early Anabaptists in the 1520s and 30s. They want to pretend that's not what we are now, so, it's unfair to put them in our group. It's yeah, it's not what you are now, but it is what you were then, and yes, those people got killed off, and that's great that it didn't survive, but yeah, that's part of your tradition. You got to deal with it. So these firebrand insurrections rightly belong in the Anabaptist category. They shouldn't just be ignored because they're embarrassing to them. The Old Klooster is just one example, and so is Munster. And we need to return to Munster, finish up that story quick. So the sending of the apostles, these apostolic emissaries, remember, they're apostolic primitivists, so they're sending them out like apostles, like they're mimicking. That, in large part, failed. John of Leiden's effort there failed. And the Prince Bishop, their army would shoot in messages on arrows over the walls, and they would try to foment internal insurrection against the Anabaptist leaders. They would promise mercy if they would overthrow the leaders. And that date that he set for military victory, it was approaching, and things didn't look so good. So he starts to try and change it. He's got to pivot when he sees it's not going to work. So he claims a new revelation that they are not going to be physically delivered. They're only going to be spiritually delivered. It's like the oldest trick in the book for charlatan false prophets, right? You change your prophecy to something that can't actually be seen or evaluated. So he tries to do that. And some of the starving people start begging to be let go of the city. Like, just let us go out there and be killed mercifully. We don't want to starve to death in here. This is horrible. And Leiden says, okay, yeah, you can leave, but you can't come back in. So some of these families leave outside of the city and they walk to the line, and the army doesn't accept them. They immediately kill all the men. And then they let the women and children just kind of wander in this no man's land. And they didn't trust any of the men because that had happened so many times where somebody would pretend to be a defector or give false plans and stuff. So they immediately just kill all the men off. But these women and children are sitting in there, and they're trying to eat grass because they're so hungry. And it's such a awful sight that some of the soldiers' wives who would visit would sneak food to them because it was just so barbaric. And I guess the Prince Bishop eventually gets some solid information from true defectors, people that were actually defecting, and they would say, here's how you can get in, and this guy would say, and this guy would say, but the two didn't know each other, and they would kind of confirm it, and then they would make them show them at night and that sort of thing. So he allows one of the defectors to sneak in with this band of 400 men inside the city in the middle of the night, and they use the weak points, and you had to have passwords to get through certain guards and breach the defenses. And a battle ensues in the middle of the night, right? And people are throwing things from windows onto the troops, and it's chaos, it's dark, but it eventually reaches a stalemate. And at dawn, the outside troops storm the walls. They're finally undefended because this internal thing happened, and the people kind of converged there, and the walls are undefended, and the outside army sees it, and they finally start to get in for the first time. And it just begins to be a slaughter. It's just a slaughter, and just blood everywhere. And the soldiers, though, have been instructed to take the leaders alive. So that's, they can basically kill everybody off. And they take the city back. And Bernard Rothman, he's never found, ever. He was probably killed in the fighting. They don't know. He might have been butchered beyond recognition. We don't know. Bernard Nipperdalling was found hiding in somebody's attic. Somebody was hiding him, and they promised, if you have him and you tell us, then you can keep your house and your possessions. And some lady was like, okay, I'll take that deal. And she turns over Nipperdalling. And John of Leiden is also captured. His wife, that was previously married to John Mathis, she was beheaded. The defenses of the city are completely torn down so that no event like that could happen again. The leaders are captured. They spend 7 months torturing them and questioning them. The Prince Bishop actually goes into Leiden, and he makes a comment to Leiden along the lines of, do you have any idea how much money you have cost me in these 3 years of laying siege to this city? And Leiden seizes on that opportunity. He's like, well, I've got a plan. You can recoup some of that money. You put me in a cage, you let me tour Europe, and you charge people to come and see me. And then he says, I can talk other people out of doing what I did at Munster. I can be this evangelist for not doing what we just did. And these other Anabaptist cities, or these cities where you think this might happen, where it's a threat. And I can dissuade them from our mistakes. And the Bishop, no, you're going to die. That's not going to happen. Nice try, though. Clever. So finally, in January 1536, there's a platform set up in the city square. And this city is basically devastated. They'd torn down all kinds of stuff, and there's one tower left in one of the churches. And they set up in the city square a platform. There's a large stake in the middle of the platform. And in front of them is all these various items of torture. And then off to the side, they have 3 iron cages that have been made. And they bring out those 3 men, John of Leiden, Bernard Nipperdalling, and Bernard Guingrich, who we haven't talked about, but he was one of the guys in John's court, along with King John. So they bring them out, and they see what awaits them. And Nipperdalling is just struck dumb with fear. Leiden falls on his knees. He starts begging for forgiveness. And what they do is they attach all three men to that singular pole back to back to back. And they put an iron collar around their necks to kind of hold them to the pole. And some reports have like iron spikes inside the collar so they can't move around too much. And so each man, you're right here with them, and you can see kind of out of your peripheral vision, and you can hear and you can smell what's happening to the person next to you. And you know that you're next, you're going to receive the same treatment. And it's somewhat similar to what happens to Sattler. Leiden is the first one. They raise his arms above his head like this, expose the sides. And each man, there's two men on each side, and they take the red hot tongs and they touch the skin, and the reports are like they touch the skin and immediately just bursts into flames in their armpits. And that's a sensitive area. And the ruling is that they have to endure 1 hour of that, where they just grab the flesh and start tearing it and just ripping it for 1 hour. And they just grab and yank over and over. And whenever they pass out from the pain, they have to be revived, and the time that they spend unconscious doesn't count for that hour. So it's barbaric. It's ugly. And eventually they start just tearing into the muscles and the tendons. They tear out the tongue and the throat so they can't even say anything. And then they finally, and there's different reports of how this went. And there's some reports that it was like a red hot dagger that they would just plunge into their chest to put them out of their misery eventually. Some of it was just, they just stab them to death and they die. But that is what they had to endure. So as that starts happening to Leiden, Nipperdalling sees what's happening. He tries to drop the weight off of his legs and choke himself out with the collar and tries to kill himself so he doesn't have to endure it. And they see what he's doing. So the executioners take a rope and they put it in his mouth like that and tie him up, keep his head up so he can't kill himself, so he still has to endure it. So, pretty brutal. And then they take their dead bodies, they put them in those iron cages, and they hang them up in the only church tower that's left as like a warning to everyone. Like, if you do this, this is what happens to you. It's one of the only towers left. And they left those bodies in those cages for 50 years. And finally, they took out the bones after 50 years. But the cages themselves are still there on that tower. They're still there to this day. And you can see them hanging. If you Google St. Lambert's Cathedral on Google Maps, you can see the cages hanging there. And they were taken down once in like the 1800s for repair. World War II, I think, did some damage, knocked one of them off, or they had to fix the tower. They put those cages right back up. And it came up as a vote at one point, and the city voted, keep them up. Keep them up. So I know that ending is barbaric, but you shouldn't weep for these guys. These guys were lunatic, murderous, sexual perverts. They're not martyrs, they're psychos. They're heretical killers. And there's so much detail that I had to leave out, but they are utterly despicable and violent and perverted. And it's not every day you can hear that sort of violent ending of like those red hot tongs and sort of hesitate to consider whether or not it's a fitting punishment. That's how bad they are. Regardless, though, the religion of the surrounding army, regardless of the religion of the surrounding army of Munster, the governing authorities were required as ministers of God to bear the sword against these men in justice. It doesn't matter if it was a Roman Catholic army or a Lutheran army or a secular army. Their job as ministers of God was to overthrow that city and put those men to death for their murder. They didn't necessarily have to torture them. We're not advocating that, but they were doing their job. And recognize Munster was being used as an Anabaptist beacon to call to all of Europe to do what they were doing in an attempt to call Anabaptists to start copycat movements to support them in this. And they did that through the constant publication of the literature and the sending out of the emissaries, and it's almost this missionary movement that they were trying to start. So you can see that the Anabaptists, when they did have a taste of power, they too failed to wield it justly. They did not practice the liberty that they advocated. They didn't practice the pacifism that they later advocated. Now, I'm not saying all the Anabaptists, are condemned in that way. I think the Swiss Brethren probably wouldn't have done that necessarily, but Anabaptism as a whole has this ugly, ugly beginning. Pacifism won out in the end. That is the enduring Anabaptist distinctive, but it was not initially a unifying doctrine like it was or is today. They became majority pacifists because the ones that weren't were so violent that they got themselves killed, justly killed, by governmental forces. And that is what gave the Anabaptists their reputation in the Reformation era. That's why they were considered a devilish sect and a satanic origin, and they were mercilessly eradicated. People were terrified of them because they had a horrible reputation. That story of Munster was well known. So when people back then heard about, oh, well, there's an Anabaptist presence in your city, or so-and-so, they're trying to reform the church, but they're Anabaptist, they're terrified of that. That would cause distress because of what they knew happened. So events like Munster and the Oldklooster, they cemented the reputation that's initially created by like the Peasants' War and Thomas Munster. It cemented that, where it's like Anabaptists are awful, and everybody knew it, and everybody was scared of them, and it left them in a disastrous state. Even though, by most accounts, the violent Anabaptists were the minority, possibly because they got themselves all killed, but they were, by all accounts, the minority. But it's the Swiss brethren and their progeny that were peaceful, and they were then severely distrusted no matter what, because they were associated with them, and they could not outrun that violent insurrectionist reputation that the Munster Rebellion had given them. So what they needed was a figure to sort of give them an identity outside of radicalism and fanaticism and the millennialism type doomsday stuff. And the man to do that was Menno Simons. And he is, I would say, the single most influential Anabaptist in history, and we'll pick up there tomorrow morning and kind of wrap up sort of more modern day Anabaptists, sort of a little bit more diagnosis of them.
All right, so I want to just give a quick rundown of some of the stuff we covered yesterday. So if you weren't here, I don't know, maybe you can benefit from this without necessarily hearing the previous lectures on it. We talked about the Anabaptist history, the radical wing of the Reformation, how they didn't really progress the most in their reform, but they actually regressed a little bit, and they came around, and they were actually parallel to Roman Catholics in some odd ways, some unpredictable ways. Talked about how they are apostolic primitivists. They think they're kind of recovering golden era apostolic time of the church. They are idiosyncratic traditionalists, and then very pharisaical about those traditions, where they invent man-made traditions and they elevate them to the level of God's law, and they fiercely hold to those and are very authoritarian in their churches about how they enforce those. And we talked about how they are sectarian. They're very divisive with those traditions. So those traditions, a tradition can draw you into, they can have like a Catholicity. It draws you into the Christian faith, and I mean that in the universal sense. It pulls you into the Christian faith, and then traditions can also be sectarian. That makes you very divisive. Like, these traditions separate us. They always distinguish us from everyone else, and that's what they tend to do with their traditions. They don't get drawn into the Christian faith. They divide within the Christian faith, and sometimes outside of the Christian faith. Let's see. We talked about a few of the good Anabaptists, like the Swiss Brethren and potentially Michael Sattler. These are guys that had some significant issues, but were generally at least respectable, and we should probably consider them brothers and sisters in Christ. And then we talked about some of the bad ones, and particularly about Munster and the Oldklooster rebellions and the murderous treachery and polygamy and disgusting things that happened there. And we kind of left it there. We made the point that Munster event is what gave Anabaptists the horrible reputation that they had, where everybody feared them. They were divisive. They were going to overthrow the government. They were going to kill people, and they were going to enforce their beliefs on everyone. And that's the way people viewed the Anabaptists. And that was in the mid-1530s when that wrapped up, and that prolonged. I mean, that idea prolonged for years and years and years, like generations. And so they were sort of left in shambles. And what they needed was like somebody to come along and give them a new face. That sort of thing. That's where we left it last night. And I said the man to do that was Menno Simons, and he is the single most influential Anabaptist in history, most likely. There's other people's names that come up, but it's Menno Simons that really gives them, I guess, he's kind of the face of the second generation of Anabaptists of what they're going to become. Because what they were then is not what they became now. Those radical sects within them and the fanatics within them died off. They faded from the scene. And what was left is essentially the more peaceful, holiness-focused Swiss Brethren and those types. And Menno Simmons somewhat becomes the leader of that. The Swiss Brethren, Menno Simmons, he's the leader of what becomes the Mennonites, right? That's where the Mennonites get their names, from his first name, Menno. And a lot of the Anabaptists are come from the Swiss, German, France region. The borders are a little bit in flux, but that's the heart of where they're from. And Menno's from the Netherlands, or at least he came out of there. So that's really close by, but he sort of gives it a new face. Under his leadership, they become known as the Mennonites, and the Mennonites are kind of the most enduring offshoot of the Anabaptists. It's their practices that generally over time have come to be the visible face of Anabaptists, the pacifism that they begun holding to. It's what people think of nowadays when it comes to Anabaptists. It's that. And that, that the junk drawer Anabaptist history that I talked about, it's ugly, it's sad, it's heretical a lot of times, but now it's developed into this. But it took some trajectories back then in regards to law and gospel and their misunderstanding of law and gospel and how to use law and gospel. That was set in stone in even the 1520s and 30s, and it gave them that emphasis that they have today with that tradition and stuff. But it is fair to say that like the peaceful Swiss Brethren, their ilk, they developed into the Mennonites. They are the epitome of modern-day Anabaptist. Menno was a former Dutch Roman Catholic priest. He didn't become fully Anabaptist until like 1536. So after Munster had just finished up, he becomes fully Anabaptist. And he had a humanistic background. He was able to give a more credible voice a little bit to the Anabaptists. He wrote a little bit more clearly and not so radically, I guess. Anabaptists have come to have this harmless persona, right? And that's mostly from him. He stressed the community of believers, pacifism, withdrawal from the world. Those are all still enduring things. He was a biblicist in the sense that he refused to use non-biblical language in his theology. I mentioned yesterday that he adopted the celestial flesh Christology, which is a type of heresy, like a Gnostic docetism, where Christ does not take his flesh from Mary. He has like a celestial flesh. So the way they described it was he passed through Mary like water through a reed. And so he adopted that. That has not really endured in the Anabaptist world. So that's a good thing. It's not an Anabaptist distinctive from what I've seen. You won't hear them talking about that or advocating that. So that's a good thing. It died off. Their distinctives are largely characterized by practice, not doctrine. This is an important thing about the Anabaptists. They always emphasize what you do and not so much what you believe. Like you can actually get away with heresy if you do the things they do. They don't care that much because they treat the Bible as this gray, mysterious, like it's not black and white, everything's gray, you can't really understand it, so you can get away with a lot in terms of your belief, which is not a good thing. I'm not saying this is good, it's bad, but it's all about what you do there. Their distinctives are characterized by practice. They generally rejected in the past, or at best, they ignore justification by faith alone and the forensic nature of justification and grace, all of that. And that's why I said that medieval Roman Catholic soteriology never died out. They held on to it. This synergistic idea of man and God working together to be saved. They never really abandoned it. They pretty much think like, well, Christ pays for your sins go away, and then you provide righteousness through your law keeping. And, if you sin pretty severely, you lose that then. And there's no real getting it back. So you provide your positive righteousness. And they still never teach with clarity at all the imputed righteousness of Christ. They do not understand the law's demand for perfection. They don't get that. You will not hear the imputed righteousness of Christ taught in their churches. And I get contacted, and I still meet with Anabaptists, and they will argue this point with me explicitly and deny it. They believed all of this pretty much in order to avoid antinomianism. They think like that idea where, Paul talks about, well, should we sin more so that grace may abound? They're caught up on that, like, well, if you really teach grace biblically, what we would say and argue is biblically, people fall into antinomianism, they're going to do whatever they want. If you teach that they can't lose their salvation, they're going to do whatever they want. You use law, and they're all about law and not gospel. They get obedience through law, not by producing gratitude within us, where we work out in obedience because of what God has done. It's a different perspective on how that works. And I've said that to them. I mean, it's like, you've got to get the imputed righteousness of Christ into your pulpits, or you're going to continually have these errors. Because there's some in there that, they want a little bit of change. But the thing they care about is holiness. It's become a holiness movement. Or, it did then, but it's become almost exclusively a holiness movement. They want a pure church. They're all about the pure church. But they don't understand that purity comes from imputed righteousness and by your sins being washed away. So when somebody sins and they miss the boat on that, this person has made their church impure. You got to cut them out. They excommunicate him, shun him, that sort of thing. So it just leads to a works-based view of salvation. They mimic Roman Catholicism's error in a lot of ways. They become a form of modern pietistic monks. A new kind of monkery is what the Reformers said. Like, this use of law, the way you're talking about it, instead of grace and gospel, it's a new monkery. So that's what happened to them. I mentioned the Schleitenheim Confession last night. I wanted to come to that because the Schleitenheim Confession was like their first confession of sorts. It wasn't a real confession. It was like 7 distinctives about them. But they missed their golden opportunity to kind of lay out for themselves, like, we are within the bounds of orthodoxy. And that's a good thing to do with your confessions. And they didn't do that. They did not lay themselves within the bounds of historic orthodoxy. Instead, what they do is they define themselves negatively. What I mean by that is they don't say, this is what we believe, along with all of Christendom, like the Trinity and such and such. They say, this is why we're different. This is what we believe that you guys don't. And they only lay out these negatives, the things that they're not. And they didn't necessarily deny essential doctrine in their confession. They just simply ignored it. And that which is not confessed, generation after generation, degrades generation after generation until it's essentially lost. And like I said, because of that tendency to not be systematic and define their doctrine positively, they can wander inadvertently into heresy. And it doesn't matter as long as you do the things they do, because it's all about practice, not about doctrine. So the Schleitenheim Confession is pretty short. You can actually read it in just a few minutes if you Google it. And in it, they confess about 7 points. First point, credo baptism. They call infant baptism the highest and chief abomination of the Pope. I don't know if that is the highest and chief abomination of the Pope, but we agree it's false. We believe we're credo Baptists. Second point, the practice of the ban, what they call the ban, and this has to do with church discipline. All they really mean by that is excommunication for someone who's already been warned of sin that they're in twice, and they're not leaving their sin. They say you excommunicate them and you ban them. They call it banning. But this later develops into that idea of excommunication with the addition of shunning, where you cut them off from your life. You don't even look at them. I mean, there's reports that, like, Amish, when they leave, they'll see family members they grew up with, and they'll like run into them, and the person will just turn their head and ignore them. They won't eat with you. They won't talk to you, that sort of thing. And like I said, in the church that we grew up in, you could come in repentance for a sin that you've committed. You'd still get excommunicated. You are in repentance. You are in confession. They still excommunicate because they want a pure church. You're going to bring filth into the church. You're going to bring sin into the church, and it's got to be pure. So that practice of banning developed into another Anabaptist distinctive today, but I don't think they necessarily meant that in the very beginning. Their third point was the practice of communion. It's only for true baptized believers. That's fine. We all agree with that. Fourth point, the separation of the saved from the world. But that's fine too. We agree with that. We do separate from the world. We're distinct from the world, but they describe it in a fairly extreme sense. So much so that you're almost not even of the world. We're in the world, but you're almost distinct from it in a way that you can't even interact, because we know we have to be in the world, but not of the world. But they take it to an extreme where it's like you're barely even being a light to the world because you're so cut off. You become just this oddity. You don't interact with them, and you're driven to make yourself distinct in ways you don't have to be distinct. Like, well, the world wears white shirts, we'll wear black shirts. And that's not a thing that they really do. necessarily. They do it, but not, exactly white and black shirts. But they do the opposite of the world, what the world does, even if the thing that the world does is innocuous, meaningless. I remember, like in our church growing up in the 70s, the women had like short wedding dresses. And that's kind of shocking because they're very traditional. You're like, why would they have short wedding dresses? The only reason was because the world had long wedding dresses. It doesn't matter that it was, I guess, technically more modest, because the point was to be different than the world, not necessarily to be consistent in your principles. So that develops into a very inward focus in the communities that they are in. I call it very insular, very isolated and insular. They have little contact with the outside world. And the more Anabaptist they are, the less contact they have with the world. Fifth point is pastors in the church are to be godly and chosen by the local congregation. Again, that's fine. We agree with that. They're pushing back against, I guess, the medieval Roman Catholic practice where these ungodly priests are just put in places. Sixth point is pacifism. So this is in the Schleitenheim Confession, and it's before Munster, so pacifism wins out, I guess, in the long run. The church is not supposed to bear the sword, only the civil magistrate bears the sword. Great, we agree with that. But what they take it to the point of Christians shouldn't even serve in the civil magistrate. So whereas the civil magistrate in Scripture is called like a minister of God, and a servant to God, and is meant to punish evildoers, they want this separation. It's almost like a necessary evil to them. Like, okay, they bear the sword, but they're bad, almost. Like, don't even vote. Some of them will take it that far. Don't vote, or don't serve in those roles or functions at all. And that doesn't always endure. They're not all consistent with that, but there's a lot of that theme amongst them. And then number 7, they have this forbidding of swearing or taking oaths. And that's literally like swearing, and they just take Jesus' words very literally there about let your no be no, yes be yes, that sort of thing. And it's a different point. We're not going to spend a bunch of time on that. But the emphasis of these articles is the holiness of the church, right? It's about the holiness. And even though Schleitenheim is generally not really used in the Anabaptist churches, like you won't go in and find a Schleitenheim confession in there, and you won't find it on their websites generally. But all 7 of these positions were present in our church growing up. They were very present. So we didn't know those 7 points, but those 7 points were part of us as being Anabaptists. And you see, if these 7 articles were, I guess, the only thing that they added to American evangelicalism, if that was the only addition from Anabaptists that you find, then they would kind of just be a slightly quirky sect. That would be it, But they'd still be worthy of respect. Fraternity, Christian fraternity, we'd agree, it's another Christian group. They're a little weird. They have some idiosyncrasies, but it's not that big a deal. If that was all that they brought, but in only confessing those 7 articles, they left open the definition of the gospel itself, and they don't define it. And if Anabaptists have shown anything through their 500-year tradition, it is that rarely have they ever produced any documents or churches with the true gospel articulated clearly. It's extremely rare that they do that. You can hear, there was times, I guess, in our church, like we had a morning afternoon service, you could hear the gospel in the morning and you could hear heresy in the afternoon. It's so ill-defined that you might hear true grace and you might hear Pharisaism. You might hear salvation by faith plus your works. They're just so confused. They don't define it, therefore they miss it. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. There's one more confession that's even lesser known than the Schleitenheim. Comes from the Dutch Mennonites in 1632. It's called the Dordrecht Confession, and that's the same Dort of the Canons of Dort. But it's longer, it's fuller, it's slightly more doctrinal, but still severely lacking. And again, it's not a thing that looms large in their practice because they don't really care a whole lot about doctrine. They care about practice. In there, though, the Dordrecht Confession, it confesses practices like shunning, foot washing. Foot washing is kind of a thing that develops in the 17th century amongst them. Marriage within their own church. Again, like if you marry outside their church, they often you're by default excommunicated. Forbidding of oaths, forbidding of revenge. Interestingly, it talks about ordained deaconesses in that confession as well. So that's really interesting, kind of surprising. It surprisingly confesses, though not too fully, doctrines like the Trinity, though. So that is an exception. It's great that they do that. The resurrection of the dead and hell uses words from the Nicene Creed. So it's a little bit more historic in that point, if you read it carefully, you can also see it's still pretty distinctly Arminian. It denies total depravity, says faith precedes regeneration, that sort of thing. It expectedly emphasizes holiness. It clearly de-emphasizes theology and holding to correct systems of doctrine. They have a skepticism against the institutional church, the historical church, or any doctrine that's laid out and described thoroughly. They have a natural skepticism to that. Sort of like, well, how dare you think you know that sort of thing? And if you do training, I mean, they shun that sort of thing. They shun the education in a lot of ways, in various degrees amongst them. Getting training is not revered. It's like you can't trust anyone. You can only trust the church sources. Don't get educated from anyone else. Like, for instance, when I was Anabaptist, I didn't read any outside literature. I literally just read the Bible cover to cover, and just over and over. And I didn't have anything else to read. I didn't know of anything else to read. That was a good practice. I'm not saying I shouldn't have done that, but I definitely needed some help interpreting what I was reading. I remember reading Romans 8 and 9, just being like, well, I don't know what that means. It can't mean what it looks like it's saying, so I just turn the page and ignore it. But there is a neglect of theology, of doctrine, of being systematic, which is weird because they're all about order. Our God is a God of order. I think that's great. Systematic theology is that way. He does that with doctrine too, but they don't carry it over into doctrine and theology. So that is another enduring Anabaptist characteristic. A pure church through holiness while neglecting theology. A distinctive of Anabaptists. Pure church through holiness, enforced by law, pushed by the authoritarian authority of the church. Usually it's their traditions that are very sectarian, but a neglect of theology at the same time. And this is why their church discipline devolved into church punishment. That's what it becomes, punishment, not discipline. They have to get those impure people out. That's why they want to shun, excommunicate members that are in sin, because it's about practice. And that's why they're always working so hard for salvation. They're creating their own holiness through obedience. They don't believe that they get Christ's righteousness through faith, or they don't understand it at least. They don't think it's imputed to them through faith. So they've got to create their own righteousness. Their odd practices are directly tied to theological error. And it's the same theological error that created the odd practices in the Roman Catholic Church. It's the same misunderstanding of law of the gospel. It's the same misunderstanding of what they have the authority to do in terms of the church. Like, you can't make things up. You don't get to make things up and impose it on the church. Shane couldn't get up here one Sunday and just be like, from now on, Sovereign Grace people, we drive red cars. You need to get rid of your cars and get red cars. He doesn't have the authority to do that. And you are, as his congregation, you can hold him in check to that. With an Anabaptist world, the Roman Catholic world, they both essentially can do that. They can invent whatever they want and impose it and just say, this is what we do now. They are just radically decentralized from an established historical church. They're decentralized from the historical church. And that made their theology radically disorganized and ill-defined. They do not produce systematic theologies or meaningful exegetical works. They generally demur from theological definition at all. Some of the ones that I've read, the commentaries that I've read, it's like they literally take the words of the verse and say them in a different order. So it sounds like they're saying the exact same thing, but they don't give any additional explanation. They just like restate what the verse says. And it's like, right, I mean, that's what it says, but like explain that a little more. And you don't get that sort of thing very often. And when they do, again, they will casually wander into heresy, that sort of thing. We're going to talk about it actually in the sermon. They're notoriously difficult to pin down when asking to have doctrine explained. It can be detected by, so you can't go and open a book and learn their theology. What you do is you learn it by looking at the communities that they produce. You look at what they do, and what they do is based on what they believe, even though what they believe is very ill-defined. And so in those communities that they have, because they're very insular and that sort of thing, and they'll produce and create intentional communities, they have what I call a lived-in dogma more than a confessional dogma. It's a lived-in dogma. You basically, you know the ins and outs of what you're supposed to be doing and how to be part of the community that they created, and you do that through living the experience. By growing up in it and spending time with them, you learn the practical dogma, the things that they do, the practices. And when you mess up, you get talked to from somebody. And if you ignore what they say or ignore the authority, then you'll get admonished or kicked out. And that's sort of how you learn it. It's like, no, we don't do that here. I remember my brother, when you start your repentance process in our church, he went to see the elder and he wore shorts and sandals. That was a big no-no. You don't do either one of those individually, let alone together. He didn't know. He didn't pay enough attention to the lived-in dogma. Well, he found out. It's like, you don't wear that. You don't wear sandals. Christians don't wear sandals. Christians don't wear shorts. It's like, oh, okay. Why is that? Because we don't do that here. That's it. That's the reason. So you learn it by growing up even in it. And we had a phrase where we were from. We called them people up FTW or OTW, from the world or of the world. We could detect them because they didn't have the lived-in dogma as innately as we did. We could tell they didn't grow up in the things that we grew up in. So we'd call them of the world or from the world. In these communities, though, like in some of they're very German, right? So they use this German word, Ordnung, and it means, it's a German word meaning like order or system or rules or discipline. And it's not written down, but you know the Ordnung because you live it. It's just like, it's the practices that you do and the things that are okay and not okay. But again, you can't go find a book with any of it defined. You just have to live in it enough to generally know what's acceptable and that sort of thing. And you get admonished, and I talked about the Amish woman where they would pin their collar, but she left 2 pins in her collar. And I'm literally talking about the head of a pin. The little tiny speck of metal showing in the back of her collar, she gets admonished for it. Because 2 pins is proud. And, the brims of their hats, are they straight enough? That sort of thing. It gets down to that sort of stuff. I talked about, the inseam of, like, these pants are khakis, but this inseam is too close to jeans. This would be, like, unacceptable in certain circles. You go to a singing with these kind of khakis, it's like, you're basically wearing just khaki-colored jeans. That's too casual. That's proud. That sort of thing. That's the sort of stuff, and these are 100% real. It sounds made up, but these are the kind of things that you learn. So you learn that through the experience, and it's supposedly centered on outward holiness, right? It's not like that it's bad, it's that you're too proud to not do what we do. And pride is a sin, and therefore that's why it's dangerous, because of your pride. You're not submitting to it. And that's what they're saying. You're rejecting the things that we do because of your pride. So it's quite simply, it becomes a moralistic world. It's all about moralism. Even the moralism is kind of made up, but it's not about grace. It's not about God's laws necessarily. It's about man's. It's about man's laws, adherence to the things they've invented. They say their works are of grace, but they mean it the same way Roman Catholics do, right? That grace empowers them to be personally holy enough to do their part in salvation. So the question of the Reformation was never, is grace necessary? It's, is grace sufficient? The Reformers say yes. The Roman Catholics said, no, you need grace, but grace isn't enough in and of itself. You have to do your part. So this lived-in dogma and moralism, it's kind of created cult-like tendencies. I'm not saying they technically are cults, but they act cult-like very often. Radical separatism, authoritarianism, their radical separatism is so distinct that, and I mentioned this to somebody yesterday, their inbreeding has become a problem in some of their communities. They're so insular and within themselves, they breed a little bit too closely together, and some of those repercussions, you do that generation after generation after generation, it starts to become, you get medical issues popping up. It wasn't that bad in the world that we grew up in, but I know multiple second, third cousins that got married. I mean, you don't think of your second and third cousins as like you're too closely related to them. And they're on the radar for marriage. It was possible. So there just wasn't any scandal to it. It was just sort of normal. It's just understood, we're kind of all more fairly closely related than most of what our society is comfortable with. And in a multiplicity of ways, they're intentionally distinct from modern society, though. They want to be distinct in all these ways. One of their reasons they're such a mysterious group to so many is because they have consciously separated, right, in both from the world, from the rest of the church, and they've become this oddity. They're now viewed as like a novelty, a harmless novelty. The Anabaptists are this novelty, or even, and I said this last night to somebody too, a tourist attraction. I think we were talking about that, right? They've become a tourist attraction in Pennsylvania. People come to view them almost like they're going to the zoo. And it's a big business, honestly. But being a tourist attraction is not what our faith is meant to be. People to come look at us as being odd for the sake of being odd. No. I mean, that's not how you're an ambassador to Christ in the world. You're not shining the light of Christ by being weird on purpose. That's kind of what they've done, though. And the whole tourist industry in Pennsylvania, there's this Amish tourist world, and that's not what the church is meant to be. Anabaptism has become this sort of mystical, biblical pietism, modern pietistic monks. It's woodenly literal, but selective, very selective when they're going to be woodenly literal. The inconsistencies come up all over the place, and they're glaring, and sometimes they're laughable. They're against newness on almost everything, but they'll accept tractors in some cases. But, you can have a tractor, but you can't have rubber wheels on your tractor. It's like, okay, why? It's just like an arbitrary line in the sand. They might allow phones on their property, but they can't have the phone in the house. But the phone is right outside the house. Okay, is the phone okay or is it not? I mean, why have it on the property if it's not okay? Why is it okay there but not there? This 20-foot distance changes something? They'll use power from an engine, but not power from electricity. It's still power. What difference does it make? It's laughably silly, right? And I'm not saying all Anabaptists are like this. This is just, examples from some of their groups. They also have this radical dichotomy between Old Testament and New Testament. They don't see the unity of Scripture at all. At all. They don't have a consistent hermeneutic at all. I mean, if you hear them talk about how they try to interpret the Bible, I mean, it's almost sad with how untaught they are and how dangerous it can be. They're like children wandering around in a room full of guns and knives. They just don't know what they're doing at times. I had someone question to me once that the biblical patriarchs are even saved because they came before a time of Christ. And I was just, how do you get there? Is Abraham saved? I mean, he was before Christ. By default, he's not saved. Just what in the world? And that radical, they just don't even know how to understand Scripture. They don't understand God's sending of his son and his sacrifice being retroactive and faith saving you like a progressive faith or prospective faith versus a retrospective faith, and having faith in the same object still saves you, no? They don't get that sort of thing. Again, they neglect theology and doctrine, so they'll fall into stuff like that. Bible reading and study, it's something they tend to shy away from. They're more concerned with looking the part, submitting to church authority. You might even hear comments about you wouldn't even need the Bible if we would just listen to the church elders or the church leaders and that sort of thing. Those comments get made. We wouldn't even need the Bible. All we have to do is submit to them and we're safe. I mentioned yesterday how carrying a Bible was almost a sign of being rebellious. I think one of our aunts once, in the 2000s, talked about how their church is allowing them to do Bible study now. And it was like, wow, this giant leap forward. And we're just like, I guess that's good, yeah. But you had a church that didn't allow you to do that? Didn't want that sort of thing. They'll casually entertain severe error, almost inadvertently wander into heresy, like I said, because they have this cavalier attitude towards historical theology. Even many that come out of the Anabaptist church, they're left extremely vulnerable. And if they're not coming out for distinctly biblical reasons, like if they didn't learn doctrine and then say, oh, this doesn't comport with what I've been raised in, I'm going to leave and get into a biblical church. If they don't come out for those reasons, then they come out extremely vulnerable to almost anything. They'll fall for charismatic stuff, Roman Catholic stuff. They have no idea. And I've likened them to babies crawling on the floor that just pick up anything and put it in their mouths because they have no idea what's food or not. What's good for them to eat? A piece of food, a dead bug, a rock. I mean, they don't know. They're vulnerable. And they wear this non-systematic mentality almost like a badge of honor. It's like a good thing to them because you're more spiritual this way because you haven't adopted a system that tells you what to believe. And whenever they're faced with inconsistencies, they take their faith enduring through that as like a sign of the strength of their faith. Like, I believe in spite of these inconsistencies. It proves the strength of their faith because even when there's proof that says something different, they'll continue in what they've believed and done in spite of that, and that's like a sign that they're more spiritual almost. Like the ministers I talked about, like how they didn't prepare the sermons, and a lot of Anabaptists are like this. They wouldn't prepare the sermons. Their ill-preparedness, not knowing what they're going to talk about, that was a sign of being spiritual because they were more trusting in the Spirit. Same with the marriages, right? Not knowing the person is more spiritual because you're trusting God more to make you have a happy marriage with a person you don't know well enough, that sort of thing. So they wear all of it as a badge of honor. They cannot explain how they are saved by faith apart from works of the law. And good luck getting them to try to explain it. It's extremely frustrating to do that. For them, all they will conclude, they'll basically say, well, I know I'm supposed to have faith, okay? I know I'm supposed to do good works, so I don't know how they work together. I'm not even convinced that it matters, I know how it works together, but I know I'm supposed to have both, so I'll do both. And that defaults to work salvation. It's always going to default to work salvation. So they don't know how such things works. The way that the inner monologue goes for them, they think obey, work, do good, submit. And they are hard workers. But that's kind of how they're thinking. Machen has a quote where he said once that liberalism is altogether in the imperative mood, while Christianity begins with a triumphant indicative. And I think that same accusation can be made of the Anabaptists. What that means is they live in the imperative mood. The imperative tells you what to do, right? That's how they live. That's how they think. Do. They don't think this is what's been done. It's all accomplished. Christ did it. They don't think in that mode. They think in what they do. Do. So those imperatives revolve, when they think in that mode, it revolves around those idiosyncratic, authoritarianly enforced traditions. Those are the things that you do all the time. They never have understood how serious it is to add to the law of God with their traditions. They've never understood it, and it's crazy, this stuff they'll invent. So because of all this, I think it's fair to say the Anabaptists have missed the boat on the Reformation. They got law gospel wrong, they mix it up, and they've missed the boat on the Reformation. And once you see that, once you see what's behind them and why they do what they do, I think you can see why it's fair to say that. Their forced asceticism is not a novelty. It's not a tourist attraction, and it's not admirable. It's not admirable. You don't please God giving things up that he doesn't say to give up. It's not admirable to, not have a phone in your house or not use modern technology just to prove that you're willing to do it. That's adding to God's law. He doesn't want us being ascetics that way. So their old-fashioned dress and their old-fashioned lifestyle are not quaint the way that the world thinks of them. It's not like this quaint, neat little thing. Their communities are harboring a web of traditionalism from which they are terrified to escape. They are burdened with law. And when they come into the gospel, it's great because it's such a relief to them. But they live under a burden of law. They're like Pilgrim in Pilgrim's Progress with that giant load on his back. That's their entire Christian walk because they've had so much law laid up on them. Their unique communities and churches and lifestyles themselves have become idols. So it seems like it's around Christ and religion and Scripture, but it's not. What they are preserving is this lifestyle that they've created, their little communities they've created. And I'm not saying they're all unsaved necessarily, but without a doubt, the more Anabaptist they are, the more likely it is that they don't know the gospel. If they're Anabaptist, they probably don't know it with much clarity, although they might get it right. And if they're very Anabaptist, they probably don't know it, and they probably need to be evangelized. So if you ever interact with them, evangelize them. They need to understand the work's been done. Help them get into a healthy church. Don't be surprised if they are skittish, I guess, around you. They are openly skeptical towards outsiders. Avoid any form of aggression with them. That'll just reinforce what they believe about you anyway. Don't be offended if they rebuff you. They're probably scared, Stopping being Anabaptist in some of the most Anabaptist communities is leaving everything that you've ever known. All your family, all your friends, this entire network, this safety network, an entire community. It'd be like moving out of your own country into another country. That's what it's like. It's depending on how Anabaptist they are. When we left, my wife asked me to write a thing explaining why we were leaving. We weren't going back to the world. We weren't returning to a life of sin. We wanted to explain, here's our doctrinal, theological, and practical reasons for leaving this church. And we're going to another church, and we're still Christian. And that led to a lot of things. But leaving is a big deal. It's a very big deal. Because you're leaving generations of your family, honestly. It's sort of like when Mormons leave. I mean, they leave their entire life behind. You're calling them to a radical change in their life. So it's life-changing for them. It disconnects them from everything and everyone that they've ever known to some degree. So be kind, be patient, trust the Holy Spirit to break through to them. That they have that hardened Swiss and German psychology that I referenced yesterday. But that, honestly, their psychology, that Swiss-German psychology that's steadfast, kind of unwavering, they can be hard-nosed and hard-headed. Once it's regenerated, it becomes a powerful weapon in the church. They can be some of the best church members. They're very used to working. They're very used to dedication. They show up to everything. They can be awesome church members. I don't know if you'll ever get one here, but you'll find that. They make great church members. I hope to see many, many more of them in the future.